Banished, humiliated, forgotten, that was Lady Evelyn's life, until she walked away from the ballroom that night, determined to prove the world wrong. Now, 5 years later, she returns no longer invisible, no longer the plain girl. The Duke who dismissed her will meet her again, but this time she won't be the one fading into the background. The question is, will he even recognize the woman she's become? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this romantic tale from the past, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. London, May 18. 63. The gas-lit chandeliers of Lady Ashford's ballroom cast a golden glow across marble floors, so polished they might have been mirrors. Lady Evelyn Grace Harrow stood near the terrace doors, half hidden by an arrangement of potted palms, and wondered not for the first time that evening why she had allowed herself to be persuaded to attend. The answer, of course, stood across the room in burgundy silk and garnets. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her stepmother, who collected social triumphs the way other women collected porcelain figurines. Evelyn's presence at the pinnacle event of the London season was not kindness but strategy, a contrast to make Beatrice's preserved beauty shine all the brighter. At 22, Evelyn knew precisely what society thought of her. The whispers followed her like an unwelcome shadow. Poor plain Evelyn, unfortunate girl, at least she's well-mannered. She had learned, over years of such assessments, to make herself small, unobtrusive. If she could not be beautiful, perhaps she could be invisible, and invisibility might prove kinder than scrutiny. Her gown of faded lilac muslin, outdated by at least 2 seasons, and simple in cut, where other women wore elaborate crinolines that required doorways to be navigated sideways, whispered against her legs as she shifted position. Around her, silk rustled like distant waves, punctuated by laughter that seemed always to be at someone's expense. Her light brown hair was arranged in modest braids that required no lady's maid's expertise, adorned only by her mother's single strand of pearls. The necklace was the sole piece of jewelry she owned that hadn't been sold to pay her father's gambling debts. Evelyn's grey-blue eyes moved across the glittering assembly with the careful observation of someone who had spent a lifetime watching rather than participating. She catalogued the room's geography with practiced efficiency. The receiving line where Lady Ashford held court, the dance floor where couples waltzed in complicated patterns, the refreshment tables laden with champagne and delicacies most attendees would barely touch. And there, near the grand staircase, stood the gravitational center of every female gaze in the room. Adrian Blackwell, the Duke of Blackwell, was 30 years old and possessed the kind of aristocratic bearing that seemed bred into bone and sinew. Tall and dark-haired, he wore his black tailcoat and white cravat with the casual perfection of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy space in the world. His grey eyes, a shade darker than Evelyn's own, surveyed the ballroom with the assessing coolness of someone appraising horseflesh at Tattersall's. He stood among a cluster of gentlemen, but there was no question who commanded the group. Lord Henry Vale, shorter and more jovial, with sandy hair and a quick smile, leaned close to say something that made the Duke's mouth quirk in what might have been amusement. Around them, other lords orbited like lesser planets around the sun. Evelyn had been watching the Duke peripherally, carefully for the better part of an hour, not with any foolish romantic hope. She had learned long ago not to entertain such fantasies. Rather, she watched him the way she watched everything, with the quiet attention of someone who existed on the margins and had learned to find interest in observation itself. She was so absorbed in her study that she failed to notice Lady Beatrice's approach until her stepmother's voice cut through the general murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. Poor Evelyn. Beatrice's voice carried across the immediate area with the perfect projection of someone who wished to be overheard. So plain, so forgettable. One must admire her courage in attending, knowing she'll spend the evening pressed against the wallpaper like part of the decoration. The words landed with the precision of an assassin's knife. Nearby guests, Lady Thornbury in peacock blue, Miss Pemberton with her elaborate coiffure, several others whose names Evelyn had long since stopped trying to remember, tittered behind painted fans. The sound was delicate, feminine, and utterly cruel. Evelyn's fingers tightened on her own fan until the ivory sticks threatened to crack. Her face, she knew, remained composed. Years of practice had taught her to school her features into pleasant neutrality, to absorb insults the way stone absorbed rain silently, giving nothing back. But inside, something cracked just slightly. Not broke, she had endured too much to break over mere words, but cracked, like china developing a hairline fracture that would spread, eventually, into something irreparable. She became aware of other eyes turning toward her. The assessment was swift and unanimous. Yes, poor plain Evelyn, exactly as Lady Beatrice described. The consensus was almost visible in the slight nods, the knowing glances exchanged between matrons and debutantes alike. "I say, Blackwell." Lord Henry Vale's voice rose above the whispers, loud enough that Evelyn heard every word, despite the 20 feet separating them. "Show the poor girl some kindness. One dance wouldn't kill you. It might even be considered charitable." Evelyn's breath caught. She hadn't realized the Duke's attention or his friends had turned in her direction at all. For one terrible, hopeful moment, she made the mistake of looking directly at Adrian Blackwell. His grey eyes met hers across the expanse of gleaming floor. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds, long enough for her to see the assessment in his gaze, the brief consideration, and then the dismissal. He looked away as one might look away from something mildly distasteful. When he spoke, his voice carried the bored drawl of absolute certainty, the tone of a man who had never questioned whether his opinions mattered. "I dance with ladies who enhance my reputation, Vale, not diminish it. I've no interest in charity cases, particularly those who seem designed by nature to fade into the drapery." The words hung in the air like smoke. Around them, conversation didn't stop. That would have been too obvious, but it shifted. The way a flock of birds shifts direction as one organism. People pretended not to have heard, while ensuring they missed not a single syllable. Evelyn could feel their satisfaction, their vindication. Here was confirmation of what they all believed. She was beneath notice, unworthy even of pity. Lady Beatrice's smile was triumphant. For a long moment, Evelyn simply stood there, her untouched glass of champagne growing warm in her gloved hand. She could feel the weight of expectations settling on her shoulders like a cloak. They expected tears, expected her to flee in humiliation, expected some dramatic display of feminine distress that would provide entertainment for the remainder of the evening and gossip for the week to follow. She would not give them that satisfaction. With movements as deliberate as a dancer's, Evelyn set down her champagne glass on a nearby table. She met Lady Beatrice's gaze, directly saw the challenge there, the triumph, the casual cruelty that had characterized their relationship since her father's remarriage 8 years ago. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the ballroom's exit. She did not hurry, did not gather her skirts and run. She simply moved through the crowd with measured grace, her spine straight, her face composed. The sea of silk and jewels parted slightly to let her pass, whispers following in her wake like foam trailing a ship. "Did you hear what the Duke said? Designed to fade into the drapery, how cutting. Poor thing. Though he's not wrong, is he? Where is she going? Probably to compose herself. How embarrassing." Evelyn heard none of it. Or rather, she heard all of it and let it wash over her without penetration, the way one might let rain fall without truly feeling wet. She had learned this skill over years of being the object of such commentary. The terrace doors stood open to admit the cool May evening. She stepped through them into darkness punctuated by starlight, into air that smelled of coal smoke and distant gardens rather than perfume and candle wax. Out here, the sounds of the ballroom became muffled violin music, and laughter reduced to a pleasant murmur, like the ocean heard from a great distance. Evelyn moved to the stone balustrade and gripped it with both hands, grateful for the cool solidity of marble beneath her fingers. The night sky stretched above her, vast and indifferent. Stars glittered with cold beauty, utterly unconcerned with the dramas unfolding in ballrooms below. London sprawled in all directions, a constellation of gaslight and shadow. For the first time that evening, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn allowed her composure to crack. A single tear slid down her cheek, warm against her cool skin. She brushed it away quickly, almost angrily. "I will not break," she whispered to the indifferent stars. "I will not give them that satisfaction." The words were a vow, a promise to herself that whatever happened next, she would endure it with the same quiet dignity she had cultivated over years of being invisible, overlooked, dismissed. Behind her, the ball continued. The Duke of Blackwell doubtless danced with ladies who enhanced his reputation. Lady Beatrice accepted compliments on her gown, her beauty, her social acumen. The world turned on its axis, Utterly unchanged by one unremarkable woman's humiliation, Evelyn stood alone on the terrace until the cold drove her inside, and then she slipped through the corridors of Ashford House to find a footman to summon her carriage. She did not return to the ballroom. The breakfast room of Harrow House received morning light through tall windows that overlooked a modest garden. Evelyn sat at the mahogany table, a cup of tea cooling before her, untouched. She had not slept. The events of the previous evening played in her mind with the relentless repetition of a music box wound too tight. Designed by nature to fade into the drapery, the words shouldn't have hurt as much as they did. She had heard worse, or at least equally cruel assessments, many times before. But something about the Duke's casual dismissal, the ease with which he had reduced her to nothing more than unfortunate upholstery, had lodged in her chest like a splinter. The door opened with the particular decisive energy that announced Lady Beatrice before she even appeared. "Ah, Evelyn. Good. We need to speak." Her stepmother swept into the room in a morning dress of deep rose, her hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. She settled into the chair across from Evelyn with the satisfied air of someone about to deliver news they particularly enjoyed. Evelyn set down her teacup carefully. "Good morning, Lady Beatrice." "I've made arrangements," Beatrice announced without preamble. "You're to go to Thornfield Cottage in Cornwall, indefinitely. The air will do you good, and frankly, your presence here has become embarrassing to the family name." The words took a moment to penetrate. "Thornfield Cottage? But that's been abandoned for years. It will suit you perfectly then," Beatrice interrupted, her smile sharp as cut glass. "Solitude for the solitary. I've already sent word to have it aired out and made habitable. You leave in 3 days." Evelyn stared at her stepmother, searching for some sign of hesitation, some indication that this was merely another of Beatrice's casual cruelties rather than a genuine plan. She found none. "You're banishing me." The words emerged flatly, a statement rather than a question. "Don't be melodramatic. I'm providing you with a comfortable retreat where you won't be subjected to the rigors of society that so clearly distress you." Beatrice poured herself tea with movements of studied elegance. "After last night's incident, it's clear that London is not the proper environment for you. In Cornwall, you can occupy yourself with whatever simple pleasures suit you. Reading, perhaps, long walks, the contemplation of nature." The subtext was clear. In Cornwall, you will be invisible. You will not embarrass me with your presence. You will cease to exist in any way that matters. "And if I refuse?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. Beatrice's eyes hardened. "This house belongs to the Harrow estate, which I manage as your father's widow. You have a small independence from your mother, barely enough to maintain yourself in modest circumstances. You may choose to use it to establish yourself in some dingy set of rooms in an unfashionable quarter, subject to gossip and speculation about what scandal drove you from your family home. Or you may accept my generous offer of Thornfield Cottage, where you may live in comfortable privacy." It was, Evelyn recognized, a trap with no exit. Beatrice had planned this carefully, had perhaps been planning it for some time. Last night's humiliation had simply provided the perfect excuse. 3 days, Evelyn repeated softly. 3 days, Beatrice confirmed. "I'll have Stevens arrange the travel. Really, Evelyn, you should be grateful. Not everyone would be so considerate." She rose and glided from the room, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and the wreckage of Evelyn's life. At White's, the Duke of Blackwell sat in a leather chair near the fire, a glass of excellent brandy in his hand, and listened to conversation swirl around him without particular interest. Harrow's packed off his plain daughter to Cornwall. "Someone," remarked Lord Pemberton, Adrian thought, though he didn't bother to look. "Can't say I blame him. Girl's a millstone around the family's neck." Adrian felt something flicker in his chest. Discomfort, perhaps, or guilt. He had not thought of the Harrow girl since the previous evening. Or rather, he had thought of her only briefly, in the moment before sleep, when her face had surfaced in his mind, that quiet, composed expression as she walked from the ballroom, not crying, not making a scene, simply leaving, designed by nature to fade into the drapery. His own words. Clever, cutting, exactly the sort of wit that his circle appreciated. Lord Henry had laughed. Others had smiled knowingly. It had been a successful rejoinder, the kind that cemented his reputation for sharp observation and sharper tongue. But now, sitting in the comfort of his club with brandy warming his throat, Adrian found the memory less satisfying than it should have been. She was being sent away because of him, or not because of him specifically, but because of the society that he represented and reinforced, because she did not meet standards of beauty that he had never questioned because he had never needed to question them. He took another sip of brandy, willing the thought away. She would be happier in the country, surely, away from the pressures of society, the constant assessments, the merciless social calculus that governed London's ballrooms. Perhaps it was a kindness, in its way. Perhaps she would find peace in Cornwall, in whatever simple occupations would fill her days. Perhaps he had done her a favor. The rationalization felt thin even as he constructed it, but Adrian Blackwell had spent 30 years learning to believe comfortable lies about himself and his world. This was simply one more. "Another brandy, Your Grace?" the server inquired. "Yes," Adrian said, "and see if Lord Henry is available. I wish to discuss the racing season, horses, politics, the management of his estates." These were proper concerns for a duke. The fate of one unremarkable girl who couldn't manage the demands of society was none of his affair. That night, alone in his chambers at Blackwell House, he saw her face again, grey-blue eyes meeting his across a ballroom floor, the brief moment of contact before he dismissed her. Not plain, exactly, but unremarkable, forgettable. He told himself this until he believed it, and then he slept. Evelyn stood in her bedroom at Harrow House, packing by candlelight though the hour was not late. Somehow, the intimacy of darkness seemed appropriate for this task, the sorting of a life into what could be carried and what must be left behind. She had few enough possessions that the work went quickly. Clothing, mostly simple and out of fashion, a few books, including her mother's copy of Wuthering Heights, its spine cracked from repeated readings, the pearl necklace, carefully wrapped in soft cloth, a miniature portrait of her mother, painted before illness had stolen the color from her cheeks. Outside her window, London continued its glittering existence. Somewhere, ballrooms were lit and music played. Somewhere, Lady Beatrice was accepting compliments, secure in her social triumph. Somewhere, the Duke of Blackwell was doing whatever dukes did when they were not casually destroying people with their words. Evelyn paused with the copy of Wuthering Heights in her hands, remembering Catherine Earnshaw's passionate declaration, "I am Heathcliff." What would it be like, she wondered, to love and be loved with such certainty, to matter so completely to another person that your very souls were intertwined? She would never know. That kind of passion, that kind of recognition, was not for girls designed by nature to fade into the drapery. But perhaps, and this thought came to her with the quiet force of revelation, perhaps there were other ways to matter, other forms of significance beyond being noticed at balls, desired by dukes, celebrated by society. Perhaps in Cornwall, far from the scrutiny that had measured her and found her wanting, she might discover what those other ways were. She tucked the novel carefully into her trunk and closed the lid. "Cornwall, then," she whispered to the empty room, to the indifferent city beyond her window, to whatever future awaited her in exile. "Let us see what I might become." The candle flickered but did not go out. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed midnight, and Evelyn Grace Harrow, who had been dismissed as plain and forgettable, allowed herself to imagine just for a moment that being forgotten by this world might be the beginning of finding herself in another. The journey to Cornwall took 3 days, and with each mile, London's soot-stained elegance gave way to something wilder, more honest. Evelyn watched through the coach window as manicured parks became rolling countryside, as cultivated gardens surrendered to untamed hedgerows thick with hawthorn and bramble. The air changed to coal smoke gradually replaced by the scent of grass and earth, and finally, as they approached the coast, the sharp tang of salt. By the 3rd day, the landscape had transformed entirely. The road narrowed to little more than a track carved between stone walls, winding through terrain that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Here, the wind bent trees into permanent submission, and the sky stretched vast and changeable, clouds racing across it like thoughts across an unsettled mind. When the coach finally crested the last hill and Thornfield Cottage came into view, Evelyn's first thought was that cottage was a misnomer. The structure was a small stone manor, 2 stories of weathered grey granite that looked as though it had grown from the cliff-top rather than been built upon it. The windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at the sea. The garden, if it could be called that, had long since surrendered to nature's designs, wild roses and brambles creating a thorny maze that pressed against the walls. And beyond it all, the sea. Evelyn heard it before she fully saw it, a constant roar, almost violent in its intensity. Waves crashed against the cliffs below with a force that seemed determined to pull the land itself into the depths. The sound was nothing like the genteel water features of London's parks. This was raw, elemental, utterly indifferent to human presence. The coach door opened, and a weathered woman in her 60s stood waiting. She wore simple grey wool and a white cap, her face lined by years of coastal wind, her eyes sharp and assessing. "You'll be Lady Evelyn, then?" It was not quite a question. "I'm Mrs. Wren. I've aired out the east bedroom and laid a fire. Supper's simple, we've no staff for fancy London cooking." Evelyn stepped down from the coach, her legs unsteady after 3 days of travel. "Thank you, Mrs. Wren. I'm grateful for your preparation." The older woman's eyes softened slightly. "You look half frozen, miss. Come inside before this wind cuts through you." The interior of Thornfield was clean but spare. Mrs. Wren had clearly done her best, but no amount of dusting could disguise the cottage's fundamental emptiness. Minimal furniture, faded curtains that had once been blue, floors of dark wood that echoed with each footstep. The fire in the drawing-room hearth provided warmth, but made the shadows in the corners seem deeper by contrast. "I'll bring your supper to the dining room in an hour," Mrs. Wren said. "The east bedroom is up the stairs, first door on the left. I'll have your trunk brought up directly." Then she was gone, her footsteps receding toward what Evelyn assumed must be the kitchen, leaving her alone in this strange, stark house that was now, apparently, her home. The first weeks passed in a haze of profound isolation. Evelyn wandered the rooms of Thornfield like a ghost, learning its geography through repetition. The drawing room with its faded chairs, the dining room where she took solitary meals, Mrs. Wren's simple cooking served on china that had seen better days, the small morning room overlooking the wild garden, the library, though it hardly deserved the name, containing perhaps 40 books, their leather bindings cracked with age. She wrote letters because it gave her something to do, some connection to the world she'd left behind. To her father: "Dear Papa, I have arrived safely in Cornwall. Thornfield is remote but adequate. I hope you are well. I remain your devoted daughter, Evelyn." No response came. To Charlotte Pemberton, who had been something approximating a friend at finishing school: "Dear Charlotte, you may have heard I've removed to Cornwall for my health. The sea air is quite bracing. I hope London continues to agree with you. Yours, Evelyn." Charlotte's reply arrived 3 weeks later. A single page of polite nothings that made clear she considered their acquaintance concluded. "How adventurous you are, dear Evelyn, to embrace such rustic solitude. I'm sure it suits you. London remains delightful as always. I must close as Lady Worthington's ball begins in 2 hours. With warm regards, C. Pemberton." The subtext was unmistakable. "I am dancing in ballrooms while you rot in exile. We have nothing more to say to one another." After that, Evelyn wrote only in her journal, pages filled with observations that no one would ever read, descriptions of the sea's changing moods, catalogues of her own loneliness, questions without answers about what she was meant to do with the remainder of her life. 3 weeks into her exile, a massive storm struck the coast. Evelyn stood at her bedroom window, watching nature's violence unfold with a kind of terrible fascination. The wind shrieked around the cottage's corners, rattling window panes in their frames. Rain fell in sheets so thick the garden disappeared into grey nothing, and the sea transformed into something monstrous, waves towering higher than houses before crashing against the cliffs with force that shook the ground. It was beautiful, terrifying and beautiful. As she watched, something inside Evelyn cracked. Not broke, she had thought herself broken already, but cracked, like ice giving way to spring thaw. "I am alone," she thought, the realization hitting with the force of those waves. Truly, completely alone. No one is coming to rescue me. No one is thinking of me. I am forgotten. The words should have been devastating. Instead, they brought a strange clarity. And then, quieter but more powerful, then I am free. Free from the weight of expectations she could never meet. Free from the constant assessment of eyes that found her wanting. Free from the exhausting work of making herself small, acceptable, invisible. Here, in this isolated cottage on the edge of the world, no one was watching. No one cared whether she was plain or beautiful, proper or improper, worthy or worthless. She could be anything, or nothing. The choice was entirely hers. The realization settled over her like a benediction. The next morning, Restless and seeking distraction, Evelyn explored parts of Thornfield she had previously ignored. In a corner room on the second floor, behind a door she'd assumed led to a closet, she discovered a small study. Dust motes danced in the light from a single window. A desk sat beneath it, and 3 walls were lined with bookshelves. Unlike the meager collection in the main library, these shelves were full, perhaps 200 volumes, their spines bearing titles that made Evelyn's breath catch. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, Darwin's On the Origin of Species, Mill's On Liberty, Poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, essays by Harriet Martineau, political treatises that would have scandalized any London drawing room. Some previous inhabitant of Thornfield, had been a radical thinker, and they had left their intellectual treasures behind. Evelyn pulled down the Wollstonecraft and opened to a random page. I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. She read standing up, too absorbed to sit. Then she carried the book downstairs and read through supper, barely tasting Mrs. Wren's fish stew. She read by firelight until the words blurred, and when she finally slept, her dreams were full of ideas rather than ballrooms. You're looking less like a ghost, miss, and more like a person with purpose, Mrs. Wren observed a week later, setting down Evelyn's breakfast with a nod of approval. Evelyn, who had brought 3 books to the table, looked up in surprise. Am I? That you are. Got some color in your cheeks, too. The walking helps, I expect. The walking had become a daily necessity. Evelyn had begun venturing beyond Thornfield's grounds, following the cliff paths toward the village of Penrith 2 miles distant. The exercise cleared her mind, and the village, small and unpretentious, offered a glimpse of life utterly different from anything she'd known in London. It was on one of these walks, a month into her exile, that she met Mrs. Alcott. The vicar's wife was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and capable hands, presiding over a small Sunday school in the church's vestry. Evelyn had slipped into the church, seeking shelter from an unexpected rain shower, and found herself examining the modest library, 2 shelves of books, mostly religious texts and primers, so worn the words were barely legible. Not much to choose from, I'm afraid, Mrs. Alcott said, appearing from the vestry with a warm smile. You must be Lady Evelyn. Mrs. Wren mentioned you'd taken Thornfield. Welcome to Penrith. Thank you, Evelyn said, surprised by the genuine welcome in the woman's voice. Mrs. Alcott hesitated, then spoke with careful boldness. Forgive me for asking, but several village girls are eager to learn their letters. Our resources are limited. She gestured at the worn primers. Would you perhaps consider helping? Even an hour a week would be transformative for them. Evelyn's first instinct was refusal. She had never taught anyone anything. What could she possibly offer? But then she thought of the books in Thornfield's hidden library, of the hunger for knowledge that had awakened in her, of young Sarah's declaration. Letters are like secret codes, aren't they? Miss, I've never taught before, she said slowly. Nor had I when I began, Mrs. Alcott replied, but I've found that a willing student and a patient teacher can accomplish remarkable things together. Then, yes, I'll try. Mrs. Alcott's face brightened. Wonderful. Sunday afternoons, if that suits you? I'll gather the girls. The following Sunday, 6 girls between the ages of 8 and 14 gathered in the church vestry, their work-roughened hands folded in their laps, regarding Evelyn with a mixture of shyness and reverence. A real lady, one whispered to another, teaching us. Evelyn, who had never felt particularly real or particularly ladylike, smiled uncertainly. My name is Miss Evelyn, she said, and I understand you'd like to learn to read? Eager nods all around. She had no formal training, no pedagogy beyond her own education, but she had books and patience and a sudden fierce desire to give these girls something London had never given her, the sense that they mattered. She began with the alphabet, but made it a game. Each letter had a story, A for adventure, B for brave, C for clever. She taught them to write their names, watching their faces light up as they saw their own identities take shape on slate. When young Sarah, 9 years old with gap-toothed grin, struggled with her letters, Evelyn didn't scold. Instead, she said gently, learning is a secret code. Once you know it, the whole world opens up. Sarah's eyes widened. Like magic? Exactly like magic, Evelyn confirmed. And watching the girl's face transform with understanding, Evelyn laughed genuinely, freely for the first time since the Ashford ball. 6 months after Evelyn's banishment, the Duke of Blackwell attended another ball. It was nearly identical to countless others: gaslit splendor, beautiful women in expensive gowns, conversation that glittered without substance. Adrian moved through the familiar choreography with practiced ease, dancing with debutantes whose names he forgot within minutes, discussing politics with lords whose opinions he could predict before they spoke. It should have been satisfying. This was his world, after all, his place. Instead, it felt hollow. Across the ballroom, a young woman in lilac caught his eye. For a single heartbeat, his breath caught, but no, it was someone else entirely. A Miss Something or other, whose face was nothing like whose? He didn't even remember the Harrow girl's first name. This was a lie. Her name was Evelyn Grace Harrow. He remembered it perfectly. "You've been damnably dull lately, Blackwell," Lord Henry said, appearing at his elbow with champagne and concern. "What's eating you?" "Nothing," Adrian replied smoothly. "Political concerns, estate matters." "Bollocks," Henry said cheerfully. "You've been distracted for months. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were pining. Don't be absurd." But that night, alone in his chambers, Adrian stood at the window overlooking London and wondered why success felt like failure, why every accomplishment seemed to emphasize the emptiness at the center of his existence. He poured brandy and told himself he was simply restless. The season would end. He would summer at his country estate. Everything would regain its proper proportion. He did not think about grey-blue eyes or quiet dignity or words he wished he could recall. Another lie. In Cornwall, as autumn gave way to winter, the Sunday lessons expanded to twice weekly. Mrs. Alcott mentioned that women in neighboring villages had heard of the lady teaching letters. More students appeared. Evelyn's small allowance from her father's trust, barely sufficient for her own needs, stretched impossibly thin as she purchased books and supplies. She began selling her London gowns, those elaborate confections that had never suited her anyway. A dressmaker in the nearby market town gave her decent prices, clearly puzzled why a lady would part with such finery. Evelyn used the money to buy primers, slates, chalk, paper. Every penny became an investment in minds hungry for knowledge. She wrote to her father one last time, "Dear Papa, I am engaged in educational charity work that requires modest additional funding. Might I access a small portion of my mother's trust for this purpose?" No response came. But 3 months into her teaching, young Sarah read an entire page of scripture, aloud, in church. The congregation, fishermen and their families, people who worked with their hands and knew the value of perseverance, burst into spontaneous applause. Sarah's father, a gruff man whose hands were scarred from nets and hooks, had tears streaming down his weathered face, and Evelyn felt something she had never experienced in London's grandest ballrooms: genuine worth. One evening, as winter approached, Evelyn stood before the cottage's single full-length mirror. The same light brown hair, the same grey-blue eyes, the same unremarkable features that London society had called plain, forgettable, designed by nature to fade into the drapery. But as she studied her reflection, she realized something had changed, not in her face, but in the way she inhabited it. "They said I was forgettable," she whispered to her reflection. "Perhaps I was because I believed them, because I made myself small. But what if I stopped trying to be what they wanted and became something entirely my own?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but powerful. She thought of her students' eager faces, of Mrs. Alcott's gratitude, of the way learning transformed people from the inside out. She thought of the books in Thornfield's hidden library and the ideas they contained: radical, dangerous, true. She thought of London, where she had spent 22 years trying to be acceptable and failing. And she thought of Cornwall, where in 6 months she had built something real. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity. She would stay, not as an exile enduring banishment, but as a woman claiming her life. She would build her school, teach her students, transform not her face, but her existence into something that mattered. Summer gave way to autumn, autumn to winter, winter to spring again. And with each turning, Evelyn Grace Harrow became less the girl London forgot and more the woman Cornwall needed. One evening in late spring, as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Evelyn stood on the cliffs above Thornfield. The wind pulled her hair loose from its pins, sending it streaming behind her like a banner. Under her arm, she carried a stack of books, new primers she'd purchased from the sale of her last London gown. Behind her, smoke rose from Thornfield's chimneys. The cottage was no longer cold and abandoned. It was warm, alive, a home, her home. In London, society danced on, oblivious. The Duke of Blackwell attended balls and managed estates, and never spoke of plain girls he'd dismissed. But in a small Cornish village, in a church vestry and a cottage library, and the hungry minds of fishermen's daughters, a revolution of quiet minds was beginning. And Evelyn Grace Harrow, forgotten, dismissed, exiled, stood at its centre, finally, gloriously free. Chapter 3. The Woman She Became. Cornwall, May 1868. 5 years had transformed Thornfield Cottage in ways that would have seemed impossible to the lonely exile who first arrived on its doorstep. The wild garden had been tamed into productivity, vegetables grew in neat rows, herbs flourished in beds bordered by stone, and those brambling wild roses had been trained into archways that framed the path to the door. The cottage itself had been modestly expanded, a small wing added with the help of local craftsmen whose daughters attended Evelyn's school and who considered their labor a form of tuition payment. Smoke rose from the chimneys even in late spring, for the cottage now housed not just Evelyn and Mrs. Wren, but often students who stayed late into the evening, reluctant to leave their books. At 27, Evelyn Grace Harrow looked much as she had at 22, the same light brown hair, the same grey-blue eyes, the same features that London had deemed unremarkable. But something fundamental had shifted in the way she inhabited her body, her space, her life. She wore simple clothing now, well made from practical fabrics that could withstand coastal wind and chalk dust. Her hair was styled more loosely, naturally, without the rigid propriety that London demanded. When she moved through the village of Penrith or stood before her students, there was confidence in her bearing, purpose in her step, the quiet authority of someone who had discovered her worth and no longer required external validation to confirm it. On this particular morning, she stood in the converted barn that now served as street, Morwen's School for Women, watching her students, 20 of them now, ranging from 8 to 45, bent over their copybooks, practicing the week's grammar lesson. What had begun as Sunday lessons in a church vestry had grown into something far more substantial. The barn, donated by a farmer whose wife had learned to read at age 50 and wept with joy at managing her first letter to her sister, had been transformed into a proper schoolhouse. Desks stood in neat rows purchased with mysterious donations Evelyn still couldn't explain. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books on every subject she could acquire. Maps hung beside the chalkboard where Evelyn taught not just reading and writing, but arithmetic, basic science, household economy, even art appreciation. Miss Evelyn? Young Sarah, not so young anymore at 14, serving now as assistant teacher, approached with a question from one of the newer students. Yes, Sarah? Mrs. Pascoe is confused about the subjunctive mood. Evelyn smiled. 5 years ago, Sarah had struggled with her letters. Now she used terms like subjunctive mood with casual confidence. Let's review it together, shall we? The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of education. Lessons, questions, small breakthroughs that Evelyn had learned to recognize and celebrate. When the clock struck noon and students began gathering their things, several lingered to discuss the week's reading assignment, an essay by Harriet Martineau that Evelyn would never have dared assign in a London drawing room, but which her Cornish students debated with fierce intelligence. You're transforming them, you know, Mrs. Alcott said, appearing in the doorway as the last students departed. The vicar's wife had become a close friend over the years, a partner in the work of education. Mary Pascoe told me her daughter is keeping household accounts for the pottery works now, getting paid for it too. The education transforms them, Evelyn corrected gently. I'm merely the facilitator. Don't be modest. You've built something extraordinary here. Mrs. Alcott handed her a newspaper, the Exeter Chronicle. Have you seen this week's edition? Evelyn scanned the article her friend indicated, feeling heat rise to her cheeks as she read, Lady Evelyn Harrow's innovative educational methods elevate the minds of Cornwall's working women. Street. Morwen's School stands as testimony to what can be accomplished when vision meets dedication. Her curriculum goes beyond basic literacy to encompass true intellectual development, preparing women not merely for domestic service, but for economic participation and civic engagement. Regional fame, Mrs. Alcott said with satisfaction. Well deserved. But fame, however regional, made Evelyn uncomfortable. She had built the school not for recognition, but because the work itself mattered, because watching minds awaken to their own potential was the most satisfying thing she'd ever experienced. Speaking of recognition, she said, changing the subject, another donation arrived yesterday. £200, same as always. No name, just a London postmark. Mrs. Alcott's eyebrows rose. That's the what? 12th such donation? 13th. They've been arriving quarterly for 3 years now. Mrs. Wren thinks it's someone from your past making amends. Mrs. Wren watches too much melodrama in the village productions, Evelyn said, though she'd wondered the same thing herself. More likely it's a charitable organisation that prefers anonymity. But £200 was no small sum, and the consistency of the donations suggested personal investment rather than institutional charity. Whoever the benefactor was, they had made Street Morwen's expansion possible, the new desks, the growing library, and now art supplies for the drawing class Evelyn planned to introduce. I wish I could thank them properly, she admitted, or at least understand why they help. Perhaps they simply believe in what you're doing. Perhaps. But the mystery nagged at her, a puzzle with missing pieces. 2 years into her exile before the school, before the recognition, when Thornfield was still primarily a refuge from the world Evelyn had discovered she could paint, it began as therapy, really. Long afternoons with nothing but her thoughts had threatened to drive her mad, so she'd purchased watercolours and paper from the village shop and attempted to capture Cornwall's dramatic landscapes. She had no training, only observation, and a desperate need to create something beautiful from her isolation. To her surprise, she had talent. Her early work was tentative seascapes and cliff views, flowers from the garden, the play of light on water. But gradually, her subjects shifted. She began painting people, the fishwife who sold mackerel in the village square, her face weathered by wind and lined by years, but with eyes that held profound kindness. The midwife who had delivered half of Penrith's children, her capable hands folded in her lap. The widow who ran a successful pottery business, clay perpetually under her fingernails. Women of worth whom society never bothered to paint. She called the collection Unseen, portraits that insisted on visibility for those the world habitually overlooked. 3 months ago, a travelling art dealer from Exeter had stopped in Penrith and somehow found his way to Thornfield. He'd seen her work and offered to exhibit it in a small gallery. "These are extraordinary, Lady Evelyn," he'd said, studying the portrait of the fishwife with genuine admiration. "You capture not just appearance but essence. London would—" "Not London," she'd interrupted quickly. "Exeter, then. A modest showing. Let others see what you've accomplished." She had agreed, though the idea of public display made her profoundly uncomfortable. The exhibition was scheduled for July, just 2 months away. But now, everything had changed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the mail coach, along with a parcel of new books for the school. Evelyn recognized the London solicitor's seal before she opened it, and her stomach tightened with inexplicable dread. "Dear Lady Evelyn, it is my unfortunate duty to inform you that Viscount Harrow passed away on the 14th inst, following a brief illness. The memorial service will be held at Street, James Church, London, on the 3rd of June. Your presence is requested as his sole surviving child. Please contact this office at your earliest convenience regarding matters of the estate. Your obedient servant, Mr. Gerald Whitmore, solicitor." Evelyn read the letter twice, waiting for grief to arrive. Instead, she felt a complex tangle of emotions she couldn't quite name. Sadness, yes, but not for the father who had existed, rather for the father who might have existed, who might have loved her, defended her, seen her worth. That father had never been real. She was mourning a fiction. A second letter had arrived with the first, this one in Lady Beatrice's distinctive hand. "Evelyn, your attendance at your father's memorial is expected for propriety's sake. Arrangements have been made for your stay at Harrow House. Do try not to embarrass the family further. Lady Beatrice Harrow." No condolences, no acknowledgement that Evelyn might be grieving. Just the familiar contempt wrapped in a thin veneer of civility. For a long moment, Evelyn sat with both letters in her lap, staring out at the garden without seeing it. "Bad news, miss?" Mrs. Wren asked gently, setting down a tea tray. "My father has died. There's to be a memorial service in London." Mrs. Wren's weathered face softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry, miss. Were you close?" "No, but I wish we had been. Will you go? To London?" That was the question, wasn't it? Evelyn had built a life in Cornwall precisely because it was far from London's judgment, far from the world that had found her wanting. Why invite that scrutiny back into her existence? I don't know, she admitted. The decision crystallized over the next few days, shaped by conversations that approached the question from different angles. Mrs. Wren's perspective was characteristically direct. You're not the frightened girl they sent away, miss. You're a woman of accomplishment now. Let them see what they discarded. But Evelyn wasn't certain she cared whether London saw anything at all. I built a life here precisely because I was free from their judgment. Why invite it back? It was Sarah, surprisingly, who provided the argument that resonated most deeply. The girl appeared at Thornfield one evening, ostensibly to return borrowed books, but clearly wanting to discuss something more substantial. You're thinking about the London Memorial, she said, not a question. How did you? Mrs. Wren mentioned it. Miss Evelyn, you've always taught us that education means we don't have to accept the world's limitations. That learning gives us power to define ourselves rather than accepting others' definitions. That's true. Then maybe you need to show them and yourself that you learned that lesson too. Evelyn looked at this girl she'd taught to read 5 years ago, now poised on the edge of young womanhood, and saw in her the transformation that education could accomplish. Sarah was right. Going to London wasn't about seeking approval. It was about proving to herself, more than anyone, that their opinion no longer had power over her. You're remarkably wise for 14, Evelyn said softly. Sarah grinned. I had a good teacher. Preparation for London required addressing one immediate problem. Evelyn had nothing appropriate to wear. The London gowns she'd brought to Cornwall had long since been sold to fund the school. Her current wardrobe consisted entirely of practical day dresses suited for teaching and walking, none remotely appropriate for a memorial service attended by London society. Mrs. Alcott, ever resourceful, connected her with a talented seamstress in the market town. Together, they designed something unique, not attempting to mimic London fashion, which Evelyn neither understood nor cared about anymore, but creating something elegant in its simplicity. The dress was deep blue silk that complemented her eyes, with clean lines and minimal ornamentation. No excessive crinolines, no elaborate trim, no desperate attempt to be something she wasn't. A dress that said, quietly but firmly, I am enough. The night before her departure, Evelyn completed one final painting for the Unseen series. It was a self-portrait, but not of herself as she was now. Instead, she painted the girl she'd been 5 years ago, standing at the Ashford ball in faded lilac muslin, half hidden by potted palms, face composed but eyes holding quiet sadness. She painted her with tenderness, with the compassion she would have shown any other subject. She painted her as beautiful in her vulnerability, dignified in her isolation, worthy despite the world's insistence otherwise. She titled it, The Girl They Called Plain. When it was finished, she stood back and studied it with tears in her eyes, not of pain, but of something like reconciliation. She had been that girl. She was no longer that girl. But that girl had deserved better than she'd received, and this portrait insisted on that truth. In London, the Duke of Blackwell sat in his study at precisely the same moment, staring at papers he couldn't focus on. At 35, Adrian had spent 5 years being exactly what society expected: dutiful, proper, managing the Blackwell estates with competence, exercising political influence with care, maintaining social standing with practiced ease. He was considered one of London's most eligible bachelors, a fact that manifested in ambitious mothers constantly parading daughters before him at every social function. He showed no interest in any of them, which only seemed to increase his desirability. Lord Henry, who had married 2 years ago and seemed genuinely happy, regularly expressed concern about his friend's determined bachelorhood. You need a wife, Blackwell, he'd said just last week over brandy at the club, or at least a purpose beyond managing properties and attending tedious social functions. I'm perfectly content, Adrian had replied. It was a lie. Alone in his study, he could admit that much. His estates prospered, his political influence grew, his social standing remained impeccable, and none of it meant anything. Success felt hollow, accomplishment felt empty. He went through the motions of his life with the distant sense that he was watching someone else live it. And then there were the dreams. For 5 years, he'd had the same recurring nightmare, a woman in lilac turning away from him into darkness. He called out, tried to follow, but she never turned back, never acknowledged him, simply walked into shadow until she disappeared entirely. He always woke from these dreams with his heart racing and a sense of loss so profound it took hours to shake. In his desk's locked drawer, which he opened now, though he'd promised himself not to, Adrian kept newspaper clippings, articles about Street Morwen's school for women in Cornwall, reports from the private investigator he'd employed for 5 years to monitor Evelyn Harrow's welfare. The donations were his, had always been his, sent anonymously because he had no right to approach her directly, because he was a coward, because guilt was easier than confrontation. The most recent investigator's report lay atop the pile. Subject continues educational work with apparent success. School enrollment has expanded significantly. Local community holds her in high regard. Note: subject will return to London on 2nd June for Father's memorial service. Will remain approximately 1 week at Harrow House. Adrian had read that final paragraph perhaps 50 times since receiving it 3 days ago. She was coming back. After 5 years, Evelyn Grace Harrow was returning to London, and he would see her again. The prospect filled him with a fear more profound than anything he'd experienced in years. What would he say to her? How could he possibly explain 5 years of silent observation, anonymous donations, carefully maintained distance? How could he explain that the woman he'd dismissed as forgettable had haunted him every day since? He couldn't. There were no words adequate to the task. And yet, she was coming. Ready or not, worthy or not, he would face the woman he'd destroyed. The day before departure, Evelyn stood on the cliffs above Thornfield one final time, watching the sun set over the sea in shades of amber and rose. Behind her, the cottage glowed with lamplight. Smoke rose from its chimneys. It was warm, alive, utterly hers. Before her, the sea stretched endless and indifferent, just as it had 5 years ago when she'd arrived in exile. But she was not the same woman who had stood here then. "I returned to London not as the girl they banished," she whispered to the wind, "but as the woman I've become. Whatever happens, they can never take that from me." The wind caught her hair, pulling it loose from its pins. She let it stream behind her, unconcerned with propriety or appearance. Here, she was free. That freedom lived inside her now, portable, permanent. London could not take it away. In his study, Adrian burned 5 years of correspondence letters he'd written to Evelyn and never sent, drafts of apologies he'd never delivered, confessions he'd never had the courage to speak aloud. The flames consumed them eagerly, turning carefully chosen words into ash and smoke. When they were gone, he stared at his reflection in the window's dark glass and hated what he saw. A man of privilege and position who had accomplished nothing that mattered. A duke whose title was the most interesting thing about him. "She's coming back," he said to his reflection. "God help me, she's coming back, and I am wholly unprepared for my reckoning." Outside, London continued its glittering existence, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding in drawing rooms and studies across the city. The memorial service was in 4 days. In 4 days, Adrian Blackwell would see Evelyn Grace Harrow again and discover whether 5 years had been enough time to become someone worthy of her forgiveness. He suspected, with sinking certainty, that 5 lifetimes wouldn't be enough. But time, merciless and indifferent, was running out. London, 1868. The city had not changed, still the same smoke-stained elegance, the same rigid hierarchies, the same ballrooms where reputations were made and destroyed with equal ease. But the woman travelling toward it most certainly had. Evelyn Grace Harrow, aged 27, sat in the coach that carried her toward the city of her exile and felt no fear. Only curiosity about what would happen when the past and present finally collided. Behind her, Cornwall receded into distance. Ahead, London approached with inexorable certainty. And in the space between and the journey itself, Evelyn held fast to the truth she'd learned over 5 years of exile and transformation. She was enough. She had always been enough. Let London try to convince her otherwise. Chapter 4. The Return. The final miles into London assaulted Evelyn's senses with the force of physical violence. Cornwall's clean coastal air gave way gradually to the acrid smell of coal smoke, thick enough to taste. Open landscapes, fields and hedgerows, sky and sea compressed into cramped streets lined with buildings that blocked out the sun. The silence she'd grown accustomed to, broken only by wind and waves, surrendered to cacophony. Vendors shouting, carriage wheels clattering on cobblestones, the constant press of humanity creating a wall of noise. After 5 years away, London felt like a foreign country. Evelyn watched through the coach window with new, critical eyes. The ostentatious wealth on display, fine carriages, elaborate shop fronts, women dripping with jewels, existed alongside desperate poverty that she'd somehow failed to notice before. Beggars huddled in doorways. Children with hollow eyes sold matches on corners. The contrast was obscene, and she wondered how she'd ever accepted it as natural. When the coach finally stopped before Harrow House, Evelyn felt nothing of the intimidation that had once characterized her relationship with this place. The elegant Georgian facade looked exactly as she'd left it, impeccably maintained, speaking of old money and older pride. But where it once seemed grand, now it simply seemed small. Stevens, the butler who had served the household for decades, opened the door with his characteristic formality. His eyes flickered over Evelyn without recognition, then widened slightly. "Lady Evelyn, welcome home." The word home landed awkwardly. This had never been home, merely a place she'd inhabited while waiting to be deemed acceptable enough for some other destination. "Thank you, Stevens. It's been some time." "Indeed, my lady. Lady Beatrice is indisposed at present, but we'll see you at dinner. I'll show you to your room." He led her not to her old bedroom, the small chamber on the 3rd floor, where she'd spent her girlhood, but to a guest room on the 2nd floor. The message was clear. She was a visitor now, not a resident. The distinction didn't wound her as Beatrice doubtless intended. If anything, it reinforced what Evelyn already knew. She didn't belong here anymore. She had somewhere else to belong. Dinner was served in the formal dining room at precisely 8 o'clock. The table, absurdly large for 2 people, gleamed with silver and crystal. An elaborate meal appeared, course by course: consommé, fish in cream sauce, roasted pheasant, vegetables in butter. Desserts Evelyn couldn't identify. It was the kind of ostentatious display that London society considered normal, and that now struck Evelyn as grotesque. Lady Beatrice sat at the head of the table in black mourning silk that somehow made her look more vibrant rather than less. At 45, she remained beautiful in the way of expensive things, carefully maintained her skin, preserved through creams, her figure corseted into fashionable shape, her hair arranged with meticulous art. Her eyes raked over Evelyn with an assessment that couldn't quite conceal surprise. Whatever she'd expected, a broken creature, diminished by exile, this poised woman clearly wasn't it. "How provincial you've become, Evelyn," Beatrice said, her voice carrying the particular sweetness that preceded cruelty. "That dress is certainly simple. I suppose Cornish standards differ from civilized society." 5 years ago, the comment would have made Evelyn shrink into herself. Now, she simply smiled calmly and took a sip of wine. "Cornish standards value substance over ornamentation," she replied. "I found it refreshing." Beatrice's fork paused halfway to her mouth. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face, as if the script she'd used for years no longer applied. "Well," she said, recovering quickly, "I suppose 5 years of isolation would give one peculiar ideas about propriety." 5 years of purpose," Evelyn corrected gently. "I've been quite occupied with my school." "Ah yes, your little educational project. How quaint." Evelyn let the dismissal pass without response. Engaging with Beatrice's barbs gave them power. Silence rendered them impotent. They ate in uncomfortable quiet, punctuated by the clink of silverware. Finally, Beatrice spoke again. "The memorial service is in 2 days. Tuesday at 11 o'clock, St. James Church. You're expected to attend, naturally, though you understand that public addresses from women are unseemly. The vicar will deliver the eulogy. If the vicar requests my participation, I'll honor Father's memory as I see fit," Evelyn said quietly. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "You've become quite bold in your exile." "I've become honest. There's a difference." Another pause, longer this time. Then Beatrice continued with studied casualness. "Everyone of importance will attend, of course. The Thornburys, the Ashfords, Lord Henry Vale and his new wife. Even the Duke of Blackwell has confirmed his attendance." Evelyn's fingers tightened momentarily on her wine glass. Her breathing paused, just for a heartbeat. Then composure returned, smooth as glass over troubled water. "I see," she said. Beatrice smiled, satisfied at having landed a blow. "I thought you should be prepared. It would be unfortunate if you were overcome by unexpected encounters. How thoughtful of you to be concerned." The sarcasm was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but Beatrice heard it. Her mouth thinned into an angry line. "You may excuse yourself, Evelyn. I find I've lost my appetite." Evelyn rose with grace, nodded politely, and left the dining room without another word. But that night, alone in the guest room with London's noise drifting through her window, her calm facade cracked slightly, she would see him again. Adrian Blackwell, the man whose casual cruelty had exiled her, whose words had confirmed every fear she'd ever harbored about her worth. Did it still hurt? She probed the memory carefully, like testing a healed wound. There was tenderness, yes, the ghost of old pain. But the sharp, bleeding agony had scabbed over, scarred, become something she'd survived rather than something that defined her. She could face him. She would face him. And his opinion, whatever it might be, no longer had the power to destroy her. The next morning, Beatrice insisted they visit Madame Dubois' exclusive dress shop for proper mourning attire. "You cannot possibly attend the memorial in that provincial dress," she declared over breakfast. "Whatever Cornwall's standards, London has expectations." Evelyn agreed, primarily because it gave her an excuse to leave Harrow House. The shop, located in an elegant part of Mayfair, was all gilt mirrors and plush carpets, gowns displayed like works of art. They were examining black silks when familiar voices made Evelyn's spine stiffen. "Such a tragedy about Lord Harrow," Lady Thornbury was saying to her daughter as they entered the fitting area. "I understand he had a daughter, but she disappeared years ago. Scandal of some sort, I believe." Evelyn turned slowly. Lady Thornbury looked exactly as she had 5 years ago, a woman in her 50s who clung to youth through expensive clothing and rigid propriety. Beside her, Cecilia had matured from cruel girl to cruel woman, her beauty as sharp and cold as cut crystal. They didn't recognize Evelyn at first. Their eyes slid past her as they would past any unremarkable person. Beatrice's smile was malicious with pleasure. "Allow me to reintroduce my stepdaughter, Lady Evelyn." The women's eyes widened in perfect synchronization. They searched Evelyn's face for the plain girl they remembered and found someone different. Not transformed in features, she looked essentially the same but different in presence, in the way she held herself, in the steady composure of her gaze. "Lady Evelyn." Lady Thornbury recovered first, her voice pitched high with false warmth. "My goodness, we had no idea, that is, we hadn't realized, that I still existed." Evelyn supplied helpfully. "How provincial you've become," Cecilia cut in with the casual cruelty she'd perfected. "Cornwall must have agreed with you in its simple way." Evelyn smiled, genuinely amused. "Cornwall taught me that beauty is far less interesting than purpose. I've been quite fulfilled." Cecilia's perfect features arranged themselves into confusion. Evelyn's response didn't fit the expected pattern. No defensiveness, no wounded pride, no desperate attempt to prove herself worthy of notice. "Well," Lady Thornbury said into the awkward silence, "we must be going. So much to prepare before Tuesday's service. I'm sure we'll see you there." They departed with indecent haste, leaving Beatrice frustrated and Evelyn oddly satisfied. At White's, Lord Henry mentioned casually over cards, "Harrow's memorial is Tuesday. Understand the daughter's returned from wherever she was hidden." "Cornwall, was it?" Adrian kept his eyes on his hand, arranging cards with fingers that wanted to tremble. "I wasn't aware Harrow had a daughter." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. Henry laughed. "Oh, you remember plain little thing. You made some quip about drapery at the Ashford ball years back. We all did. Rather cruel in retrospect, I suppose." "Ancient history," Adrian said, discarding a card with studied casualness. "Hardly worth revisiting." But his mind raced. She was here, in London. He could encounter her anywhere at the memorial, certainly, but possibly before. The city that had seemed vast now felt suffocatingly small. He made his excuses and left the club early. Back at Blackwell House, he paced his study like a caged animal. Should he approach her, attempt an apology, ignore her and hope she didn't remember him? The last thought was laughable. Of course she remembered. How could she possibly forget? He was utterly unprepared for this encounter. 5 years of planning, of silent observation, of anonymous support, and he had no idea what to actually say to her face. Evelyn escaped Harrow House the next afternoon, desperate for air and solitude. She found herself on Piccadilly, drawn by muscle memory to Hatchard's bookshop. The store was exactly as she remembered, a labyrinth of shelves, the smell of leather and paper, blessed quiet, broken only by the occasional turning page. She wandered the philosophy section, running her fingers along familiar spines, and felt something in her chest ease. This, at least, hadn't changed. She rounded a corner, and nearly collided with a tall figure, reaching for the same volume she'd been about to select, Mills on Liberty. They both froze. Adrian Blackwell stood before her in charcoal grey, impeccably dressed, looking exactly and nothing like she remembered. The same grey eyes, the same aristocratic bearing, but something had changed in his face, lines that hadn't been there before, a haunted quality around his mouth. Their hands hovered over the same book, not quite touching. "Lady Evelyn," he said, his voice hoarse. "Your Grace." Silence expanded between them. Around them, the bookshop continued its quiet business, other customers browsing, unaware of the earthquake happening in aisle 3. Adrian swallowed visibly. "I heard of your father's passing. My condolences. Thank you." Evelyn took the Mill volume from the shelf, their fingers not quite touching, though they came within inches. "I believe I reached it first." "Of course. Please." He stepped back, giving her space. More silence. She could see him struggling, words forming and dying on his lips. Finally, "I understand you've been in Cornwall, I hope. I hope the time was not entirely unpleasant." "Cornwall has been transformative, Your Grace," Evelyn said, her voice measured and calm. "I've found purpose there that London never offered me." She watched him absorb the implicit critique, saw him recognize it, flinch from it. He wanted to say more. She could see it in the way his hands clenched at his sides, in the desperation flickering across his carefully composed features. He wanted to say everything, but standing before her actual presence, words apparently failed him. "I'm glad to hear it," he said finally. "Pathetic, cowardly." She saw him recognize this, even as the words left his mouth. Evelyn studied him with calm assessment, and he seemed to shrink under her gaze despite his superior height. There was something broken in him, something that perhaps had always been there but was now visible. She felt, surprisingly, something like pity. "If you'll excuse me," she said finally. "I have much to prepare before the memorial." She nodded politely, made her purchase, and left. Adrian stood immobile among the shelves, watching her go, having failed spectacularly at his first encounter in 5 years. Evelyn walked, rather than taking a carriage, needing movement to process the roiling emotions the encounter had unleashed. Seeing him again had affected her more than expected, but not with pain. Not anymore. What she felt was more complex, harder to name. Surprise at his haunted appearance. Curiosity about what had happened to him in 5 years. And yes, that unexpected pity. He looked like a man pursued by ghosts. She wondered if one of those ghosts was her. But whatever Adrian Blackwell's torments, they were his to carry. She had come to London to bury her father and face her past. She would not allow him to derail that purpose, would not give him power over the peace she'd cultivated so carefully. By the time she reached Harrow House, her composure had returned, solid as stone. At Blackwell House, Adrian dismissed his valet and poured whiskey with shaking hands. The truth he could no longer escape. She wasn't plain. She had never been plain. He had been blind, arrogant, cruel beyond measure. And now she had returned as a woman of substance, of purpose, of quiet strength, while he remained exactly what he'd always been. A hollow title in expensive clothing. A man who had accomplished nothing that mattered. He could not let her leave London without truly speaking to her, without attempting real amends. Even if she rejected him, when she rejected him, he had to try. He sat at his desk and drafted a letter requesting a private audience. 5 versions later, they all sounded self-serving, manipulative, desperate. He burned them all and watched the words turn to ash. The night before the memorial, Evelyn stood at her window, overlooking London's glittering lights. Tomorrow she would face the entirety of society that had dismissed her. Tomorrow she would eulogize a father who had never defended her, had never valued her enough to respond to a single letter. She felt no fear, only a quiet determination. "Let them see what they discarded," she whispered to the indifferent city. "Let them wonder what they missed, and let them realize, far too late, that their opinion never mattered at all." Across London, in his own house, Adrian stared at the same sky and whispered to the darkness, "Tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll find the courage I should have had 5 years ago." But tomorrow would bring revelations neither of them anticipated, and courage alone would not be enough. The morning of the memorial dawned grey and threatening, clouds hanging low over London like a widow's veil. Street, James Church on Piccadilly, began filling early with society's elite lords and ladies in elegant black, arriving in polished carriages, ostensibly to pay respects to a man most had barely known, but whose memorial service represented a social obligation they couldn't ignore. In the guest room at Harrow House, Evelyn dressed with careful deliberation. The black silk gown was the one concession to London fashion she'd made commissioned from the local seamstress, but acknowledging the city's mourning conventions. It fit her perfectly, elegant in its simplicity, speaking of respect without ostentation. Mrs. Wren, who had insisted on accompanying Evelyn to London despite protests, helped arrange her hair. The older woman's weathered hands were surprisingly deft, pulling Evelyn's light brown locks into a simple style that was elegant precisely because it didn't try too hard. Pulled back to reveal her face rather than hide it. "Hold your head high, miss," Mrs. Wren said softly, meeting Evelyn's eyes in the mirror. "You've nothing to be ashamed of, and they've much to answer for." Evelyn smiled at her reflection, not the uncertain girl who had left London 5 years ago, but a woman who knew her worth. "Thank you, Mrs. Wren, for everything. Just speaking truth, miss, as you taught me to do." The arrival at St. James' Church was precisely choreographed for maximum social impact. Lady Beatrice, resplendent in black bombazine with jet beading, descended from the carriage first. Then Evelyn, her hand steady as she accepted the footman's assistance. They walked up the church steps together. Propriety demanded the appearance of familial unity, and whispers rippled through the assembled mourners like wind through wheat. "Is that truly the Harrow girl? She looks so different. No, wait, she looks the same, but somehow. I heard she's been running some sort of charity school in Cornwall." How provincial! Evelyn heard every word. 5 years ago, they would have destroyed her. Now they simply confirmed what she already knew. London society remained exactly as shallow as she remembered. She kept her spine straight, her expression composed, and followed Beatrice down the aisle to the front pew reserved for family. Adrian had arrived early, positioning himself toward the back of the church, partially obscured by a pillar. He told himself he was here to pay respects to Lord Harrow, a man he'd met perhaps twice in his life, with whom he'd exchanged perhaps a dozen words total. The lie was transparent even to himself. He was here to see her. When Evelyn entered, he catalogued every detail with the desperate attention of a drowning man grasping at flotsam, the straight spine that spoke of inner strength rather than rigid propriety, the quiet dignity in her movements, the way she didn't flinch under society's scrutiny, didn't shrink or apologize for occupying space. She had become magnificent. "Blackwell," Lord Henry's voice made him start. "Didn't expect to find you lurking in corners. That's not your usual style." Adrian turned to find his friend regarding him with knowing eyes. "Simply arrived early." Henry's gaze followed Adrian's to where Evelyn sat in the front pew. "That's the Harrow girl, isn't it? Hardly recognize her. She's got rather a presence about her now." "Does she?" Adrian said flatly. "You've noticed it too, then? Interesting." Henry settled into the pew beside him. This should be an intriguing service. He had no idea how right he was. The service began with traditional elements, the vicar's eulogy emphasizing Lord Harrow's largely fabricated virtues, hymns sung by a congregation that had never known the deceased, the drone of familiar prayers that provided comfort through their very familiarity. Evelyn sat beside Beatrice in the front pew, her expression serene but distant, as if she were present in body, but her mind occupied some other, more meaningful space. Adrian couldn't take his eyes off her. Then the vicar announced, "Lord Harrow's daughter, Lady Evelyn, has prepared some words of remembrance." Beatrice's head whipped toward Evelyn, shock poorly concealed. Her hand shot out to grasp Evelyn's wrist, her whisper urgent and carrying. "You can't possibly. It's inappropriate. Women don't speak at." Evelyn gently but firmly removed Beatrice's hand from her arm. Without a word, she rose and moved to the lectern with calm purpose. The congregation shifted, uncertain. This was irregular, unseemly. Women didn't deliver eulogies, didn't address assemblies, didn't claim public voice in matters of consequence. Evelyn stood before them, before all of London society, and began to speak. "My father was not a perfect man," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I do not stand before you to claim otherwise." A ripple of shock moved through the church. Society eulogies were meant to be glowing fabrications, careful constructions that elevated the deceased beyond the reality of their actual lives. Honesty was almost scandalous. "He was a man of his time and class," Evelyn continued, "with all the limitations that implies. He taught me, though perhaps not in the way he intended, that worth must be self-determined, not assigned by others." Adrian's hands gripped the pew in front of him until his knuckles went white. "I learned from his absence to value presence," Evelyn said, her eyes scanning the congregation with calm assessment. "From his silence to value voice. From his inability to see me clearly to see myself with clarity." Every word felt aimed at Adrian personally, though she never looked in his direction. He wanted to stand up, to shout that he understood, that he saw her now, that he'd been catastrophically wrong. He remained frozen, unable to move. "But I also learned that exile can be education." Evelyn's voice softened slightly. "That dismissal can be freedom, that being forgotten by society can mean being remembered by oneself." Her gaze swept across the assembled elite, touching briefly on faces that had mocked her, dismissed her, found her unworthy of notice. "Many of you have not thought of me in years. I suspect some don't remember me at all." A small smile touched her lips. "I assure you, the feeling is mutual." Somewhere in the middle pews, Lady Thornbury made a small sound of outrage. "My father gave me life," Evelyn concluded, "and for that I'm grateful. What I've done with that life has been entirely my own. I hope, in his own way, he might have been proud of the woman his daughter became, not despite his neglect, but because of my refusal to be defined by it." She returned to her seat in silence so complete that the rustle of her skirts seemed deafening. The vicar, clearly uncertain how to proceed after such an unprecedented address, cleared his throat and moved hurriedly into the closing prayers. After the service, a receiving line formed outside the church, a social ritual as choreographed as a dance. Evelyn stood with Beatrice, accepting condolences with grace that most attendees found unsettling, precisely because it was genuine rather than performed. "So sorry for your loss, my dear," Lady Pemberton gushed, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "And we're all simply fascinated by your school endeavor. How quaint." "Educational empowerment for women is many things, Lady Pemberton," Evelyn replied with a smile. "Quaint is not among them." Lady Pemberton blinked, uncertain whether she'd been insulted. Cecilia Thornbury approached with her mother, both wearing expressions of poorly concealed disdain. "You've become quite bold, Evelyn," Cecilia said. "Cornwall has made you rather outspoken." "Cornwall didn't make me anything, Cecilia," Evelyn responded calmly. "It simply removed the impediments to becoming myself." The younger woman's mouth opened, then closed. She had no response to someone who refused to play by the established rules of social combat. As the crowd thinned, Evelyn saw him approaching. Adrian Blackwell moved through the dispersing mourners with the careful determination of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and still felt wholly unprepared. Mrs. Wren had stepped away to speak with the vicar. Evelyn stood alone on the church steps, and she didn't flee, didn't look away. She simply waited with that calm that Adrian was beginning to realize was her greatest strength. "Lady Evelyn," his voice came out rougher than intended, "your words today were remarkable." "Were they?" She tilted her head slightly. "I simply spoke honestly. Perhaps that's remarkable in this context." The gentle barb landed precisely where she'd aimed it. Adrian flinched. "I deserved that. Did you?" Evelyn's expression remained neutral. "I wasn't thinking of you when I said it, Your Grace." That hurt worse than any deliberate cruelty could have. He pushed forward, desperate to say something that mattered. "I wanted to tell you. I've thought about. That is to say, I owe you." "Your Grace," Evelyn interrupted gently. "Whatever you think you owe me, I release you from the debt. I hold no grudge against you." "But you should," Adrian said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I was unconscionably cruel. I stood by while you were humiliated, banished, treated as—" "Yes," Evelyn agreed simply. "You were, and yes, you did. But my healing cannot come from your guilt, nor my peace from your apology. I've built a life I'm proud of. What you did or didn't do 5 years ago no longer has power over me." Adrian felt something break inside his chest. "It has power over me," he whispered. "Every day, every hour, I see your face that night, and I cannot escape what I've done." For the first time in the conversation, Evelyn truly looked at him, really looked, her grey-blue eyes searching his face with an assessment that felt like being laid bare. What she saw made her voice soften slightly. "Then perhaps you should examine why you did it, Your Grace. Not for my benefit, but for your own." Before he could respond, a familiar poisonous voice interrupted. "Your Grace, how kind of you to attend." Lady Beatrice appeared with perfectly timed malice. "Evelyn, We mustn't monopolize the Duke's time with our provincial concerns. Adrian surprised himself by responding immediately. Lady Evelyn's concerns are anything but provincial, Lady Beatrice. Her educational work in Cornwall has garnered significant respect. Beatrice's expression flickered with shock. The Duke of Blackwell defending her dismissed stepdaughter was entirely outside the expected script. "If you'll both excuse me," Evelyn said calmly, "I have appointments to keep." She nodded politely and descended the church steps toward a waiting carriage, leaving Adrian standing beside a stunned Beatrice. "Well," Lord Henry said, appearing at Adrian's elbow, "you look like a man who's lost something valuable." Blackwell. Adrian watched Evelyn's carriage pull away. "I lost it 5 years ago, Henry. I'm only now realizing what it was worth." His friend's expression turned uncharacteristically serious. "Then you'd better determine whether you want to spend your life regretting it or attempting to earn what you don't deserve." Inside the carriage alone, having sent Mrs. Wren ahead, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the encounter's full impact. Not pain, not anymore, but a deep sadness for the man Adrian had become, or perhaps always had been. There was something genuinely broken in him, something that ate at him from the inside. She wondered if his ghosts gave him any peace at all. But whatever Adrian Blackwell's torments, they were his to carry. She had come to London to prove she'd survived, to honor her father in the only way she could, with honesty. She'd done that. Tomorrow, she would visit the British Museum, perhaps a gallery. Then she would return to Cornwall within the week. There was no room in her life for a duke's belated regrets. That evening, in her room at Harrow House, Evelyn wrote to Sarah, "Dear Sarah, London is exactly as I left it, beautiful and hollow. The memorial service is complete. I spoke honestly about my father, and I believe he would have understood, if not approved. I find myself profoundly grateful for my real life, far from here, for students who value learning over fashion, for purpose over position, for substance over show. I will return home soon. With affection, Miss Evelyn." Across London, in his study at Blackwell House, Adrian pulled out the locked drawer. Inside lay 5 years of secret penance, newspaper clippings about Street Morwen School, investigation reports tracking Evelyn's welfare, copies of bank drafts sent anonymously to fund her work, evidence of care too cowardly to show its face. It meant nothing. She didn't know, and even if she knew, she wouldn't care. She'd made that abundantly clear. He couldn't let her leave London without understanding, without seeing that he was capable of change, not through words, which had always failed him, but through actions. He pulled out fresh paper and began writing. Not to Evelyn, but to his solicitor. "I wish to make a public donation to Street Morwen School for Women in Cornwall in the amount of £1,000. The donation is to be attributed to me personally, with my full support and endorsement of Lady Evelyn Harrow's educational work made known." If she would not accept his words, perhaps she would be forced to acknowledge his actions. It was a beginning, however inadequate, and Adrian Blackwell was running out of time. Chapter 6. Revelations and Rivals. The morning after the memorial, Evelyn sat at the small desk in her guest room at Harrow House, planning the remainder of her London visit. 3 more days, the British Museum, Hatchard's bookshop again, perhaps the National Gallery, and then she would return to Cornwall and the life that actually mattered. The Morning Post arrived with her breakfast tray. Among the formal condolence cards was a letter bearing the Penrith postmark. She recognized Mrs. Alcott's handwriting immediately. "Dearest Evelyn, the most extraordinary news. Yesterday, a solicitor arrived from London with legal documents and a bank draft. A benefactor has made an enormous donation to Street Morwen School, £1,000, and not anonymously this time. The donation comes from His Grace, the Duke of Blackwell, with his full public endorsement of your educational work. The entire village is astounded. I confess I am as well. Do you know this gentleman? Has he some connection to your work? Write soon. We are all eager to understand. Your friend, Mrs. Alcott." Evelyn read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing fresh waves of conflicting emotion. Adrian, the Duke of Blackwell. He'd made a public donation? Her mind raced backward through the years. The anonymous quarterly donations that had funded the school's expansion, they'd started arriving 6 months after her exile. For 3 years, substantial sums with no attribution, only a London postmark. Had it been him all along? And if so, why secretly for years, and why publicly now? Gratitude warred with suspicion in her chest. The money had been essential to the school's success, had helped dozens of women transform their lives. Did his motivation even matter if the result was good? But she couldn't shake the feeling that this public gesture, coming just days after their reunion, was calculated, an attempt to buy something, forgiveness, perhaps, or her attention. She wouldn't allow herself to be bought. Within an hour, Evelyn had composed a brief note and dispatched a footman to Blackwell House. "Your Grace, I require an audience at your earliest convenience to discuss certain financial matters pertaining to my school. Lady Evelyn Harrow." The response arrived before noon, written in strong, slightly unsteady script. "Lady Evelyn, I am at your disposal. Would 3 o'clock this afternoon be acceptable?" Blackwell, Mrs. Wren, who had been tidying the room when the reply arrived, frowned with concern. "Are you certain this is wise, miss? Men like that don't change their natures." "I'm not going to determine if he's changed," Evelyn replied, already preparing for the visit. "I'm going to discover the truth about these donations. Truth and men like the Duke rarely occupy the same room, in my experience. Then I shall provide the truth myself, and see how he responds to it." Blackwell House in Mayfair was everything Harrow House was not: imposing, palatial, speaking of wealth accumulated over centuries rather than mere generations. A butler so dignified he might have been carved from marble showed Evelyn through corridors lined with ancestral portraits to a private study on the second floor. Adrian stood when she entered, dismissing the butler with a gesture. For a duke accustomed to complete composure, he looked visibly unsettled, his cravat slightly askew, his hair suggesting he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. The study itself was aggressively masculine: dark wood paneling, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, hunting trophies mounted on walls. Family portraits gazed down with expressions of aristocratic certainty. This was a room designed to intimidate. Evelyn refused to be intimidated. "How long have you been funding my school, Your Grace?" She dispensed with pleasantries entirely. Adrian's throat worked as he swallowed. 5 years. Since 6 months after you left London. The donations were anonymous until now, because I had no right to claim credit for them. 5 years. Evelyn's voice remained steady, though her pulse raced. "You've been sending money for 5 years, and yet when we met in the bookshop you said nothing. Would you have accepted them if you'd known the source?" Adrian countered quietly. "That's not for you to decide on my behalf." "You're right. You're absolutely right." He moved to his desk, his movements careful. "There's something I need to show you. I ask only that you look at everything before making any judgments." He unlocked a drawer, his hands shaking slightly, and spread its contents across the desk's surface. Newspaper clippings. Dozens of them, carefully preserved, chronicling Street Morwen's school, from its earliest mentions to the recent article in the Exeter Chronicle. Quarterly reports written in an investigator's formal prose, tracking Evelyn's welfare with disturbing detail. Copies of bank drafts, all in substantial amounts, and letters, stacks of letters in Adrian's own hand, sealed but never sent. Evelyn stared at the evidence with growing astonishment. "You've been monitoring me? For 5 years?" "Not monitoring," Adrian said hoarsely. "Ensuring you were well, safe, that you had the resources to accomplish what you were building. I had no right to approach you, but I couldn't." His voice cracked. "I couldn't do nothing." Evelyn picked up one of the sealed letters, looking to Adrian for permission. He nodded, his expression naked with vulnerability. She broke the seal and read, "My dear Lady Evelyn, I hope this finds you well, though I have no right to hope anything concerning you. I have just read of your educational efforts in Cornwall, with admiration I have no right to express." She picked up another, dated 2 years later. "Evelyn, I dream sometimes that I behaved differently that night, that I possessed the courage to see what was before me, that I was a better man. I wake from these dreams with the knowledge that I was not, am not, may never be." And another, from just 6 months ago. "You have become everything I failed to recognize, and I remain exactly what I was, a titled fool mistaking pride for worth. If I could undo that night, I would trade everything I possess for the chance. But time moves only forward, and I am left with nothing but regret and the hope that you have found happiness despite me." Evelyn set the letters down with trembling hands. "Why didn't you send them?" "Because they were about my guilt, my regret, my pain," Adrian said quietly. "You'd already suffered enough because of me. Why burden you with my conscience?" For a long moment, silence filled the study. Outside, London continued its business, but in this room, 5 years of secrets lay exposed between them. I don't know what to do with this information, Adrian. The use of his given name slipped out unconsciously. Adrian noticed. His expression flickered with something that might have been hope. I'm not telling you this to manipulate forgiveness. You were right yesterday. Your healing cannot come from my guilt, but you deserve the truth. You've always deserved more truth than I gave you. Evelyn moved to the window, needing distance to think. Why were you so cruel? I've asked myself 1,000 times what I did to deserve such dismissal. Behind her, Adrian's voice emerged rough with pain. You did nothing. The fault was entirely mine. But if you want to understand, he paused. My mother was deemed too plain by my father. Not ugly, just unremarkable. He married her for her dowry and spent their entire marriage making her aware of his disappointment. Evelyn turned to face him. He kept beautiful mistresses, Adrian continued, staring at his hands. Paraded them through our home while my mother withered in the country, deemed unfit for society. She died when I was 15, lonely and forgotten. I watched my father destroy a good woman because society mocked her appearance. So you convinced yourself that marrying for beauty would prevent that fate, Evelyn said slowly, understanding dawning. Instead, I became him. Adrian's voice broke. I destroyed someone kind because I was terrified of appearing weak. I projected my father's cruelty onto you because you reminded me of my mother, good, gentle, overlooked. And I couldn't bear to be the man who valued those things when the world deemed them worthless. Evelyn felt something in her chest crack, not break, but shift. Your pain doesn't excuse what you did, Adrian. I know. When you dismissed me that night, you confirmed every fear I'd ever had about my worth. It took years to rebuild what you destroyed in moments. I know, he whispered, and yet... Evelyn paused, wrestling with a truth she'd only recently recognized. Paradoxically, your cruelty freed me. If you'd been kind, I might have stayed in London, waiting for scraps of approval. Your rejection forced me to find my own worth. Adrian looked up, his grey eyes holding hers. So I don't know whether to thank you or hate you, Evelyn continued softly. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Before Adrian could respond, a knock interrupted. The butler entered apologetically. Your Grace, Monsieur Laurent Beaumont is here. He insists he has an appointment. Adrian's brow furrowed with confusion. I scheduled no such. Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. A man entered behind the butler, tall, handsome, perhaps 42, dressed in impeccably tailored French fashion. His warm brown eyes found Evelyn immediately, and his face lit with genuine pleasure. Lady Evelyn, what a delightful surprise. Monsieur Beaumont. Evelyn couldn't help but smile. I didn't expect to see you in London. Adrian's eyes darted between them, his jaw tightening. You two are acquainted? I had the pleasure of meeting Lady Evelyn 3 months ago in Exeter, Laurent said smoothly, his English accented but perfect. At the gallery exhibition of her remarkable paintings, he turned to Evelyn, his attention complete and flattering. I've come to London specifically to propose that you exhibit your Unseen series here, in a proper London gallery. Your work deserves metropolitan recognition. That's very kind, but I've also come, Laurent continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, if I may be bold, to continue our conversation about my other proposal. Adrian's hands clenched at his sides. Other proposal? Evelyn felt heat rise to her cheeks. Monsieur Beaumont has suggested I consider expanding the school's reach to France. He's offered to help establish sister institutions in Paris and Lyon. Lady Evelyn's vision for women's education is revolutionary, Laurent explained, his admiration obvious. I've been trying to convince her that Cornwall, while charming, limits her potential impact. Imagine what she could accomplish with proper resources and reach. For the first time, Adrian confronted something worse than Evelyn's indifference, the real possibility of losing her to someone else, to a man who valued what Adrian had failed to see. Monsieur Beaumont, I appreciate your confidence, Evelyn said carefully, but I've not yet decided. Of course, no pressure. Laurent's smile was warm, genuine. I simply hope to discuss possibilities over dinner this evening, if you're available. Adrian couldn't help himself. Lady Evelyn has had a difficult few days. Perhaps she requires rest rather than social engagements. Evelyn's eyes cooled as she turned to him. I'm quite capable of managing my own schedule, Your Grace. Laurent, clearly perceiving the tension, maintained his pleasant expression. Your Grace, I assure you my intentions toward Lady Evelyn are entirely honorable. I admire her work immensely. The contrast was devastating. Laurent's uncomplicated respect for Evelyn as an intellectual equal stood in sharp relief against Adrian's history of dismissal. "I would be delighted to join you for dinner, Monsieur Beaumont," Evelyn said. "Shall we say 7 o'clock? Perfect. I'll collect you from Harrow House." Laurent bowed to both of them. "Your Grace, Lady Evelyn." Until this evening, he departed, leaving silence in his wake. "You're dining with him?" Adrian's control was slipping. "You've known him 3 months?" "Yes," Evelyn's voice was crisp. "And in those 3 months, he's shown more genuine interest in my work and ideas than London society has shown in my entire life. He doesn't know you, not truly. Neither do you, Adrian." The words landed like blows. "You knew me for perhaps 20 minutes 5 years ago, judged me in 10 seconds, and have spent the intervening time watching from a distance. Laurent has actually conversed with me, engaged with my ideas, treated me as an equal." "I know I have no right to ask," Adrian said desperately, "but please give me a chance to truly know you now, not the girl I dismissed, but the woman you've become." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. "I came to your home today seeking truth about the donations. I've received more truth than I expected, but truth about the past doesn't guarantee anything about the future. Then let me prove myself. If you want to know me, Adrian, demonstrate it through actions, not words. Show me the man you claim you've become. Prove that you've changed, not because I've returned, but because you genuinely transformed during my absence." "How?" The question was raw, vulnerable. "How do I prove that?" "That's for you to determine," Evelyn said quietly. "I will not provide a roadmap for your redemption." She gathered her things and moved toward the door. "Evelyn," she paused, looking back. "The donations," Adrian said, "they were never about buying forgiveness. They were about ensuring you had what you deserved, what I should have helped you claim from the beginning." "Perhaps," Evelyn said, "or perhaps they were about easing your conscience. Either way, the school benefited. Thank you for that at least." Then she was gone. In his lodgings near Hyde Park, Laurent Beaumont examined papers bearing an elaborate crest, not the simple seal of an art dealer, but the noble crest of the Beaumont family, one of France's oldest houses. Comte Laurent de Beaumont, to give him his full title, smiled slightly. Lady Evelyn didn't know his true rank. He'd concealed it deliberately, wanting her assessment of his ideas rather than his position. But tonight, over dinner, he would reveal himself, and offer her not just partnership in educational ventures, but the possibility of something more. That evening, Evelyn stood before her mirror, holding one of Adrian's unsent letters. "You have become everything I failed to recognize. 2 men, 2 paths." Adrian offered the complexity of redemption, a man broken by his own cruelty, desperately trying to prove he'd changed. The risk of that path was enormous. Could people truly transform, or only claim to? Laurent offered uncomplicated respect, genuine opportunity, the chance to expand her work beyond Cornwall's borders. Safe, simple, valued. Why risk pain with Adrian when Laurent provided everything she'd ever wanted without the weight of past wounds? But even as she thought it, her eyes returned to the letter in her hands. London had become unexpectedly complicated. The past refused to stay buried, and the future offered more choices than she'd anticipated. By evening, those choices would become even more complex. Chapter 7. The Exhibition and the Exposure. The French restaurant Laurent chose was everything London society pretended to be, but rarely achieved, genuinely elegant, rather than ostentatiously decorated, with intimate lighting that invited conversation rather than display. Crystal gleamed softly, and the scent of excellent wine mingled with herbs and butter. Evelyn found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving in London. "Tell me about your teaching methods," Laurent said, leaning forward with genuine interest. "The article in the Exeter Chronicle mentioned you use unconventional approaches." "I teach reading through Shakespeare and Browning rather than primers designed to make women docile," Evelyn explained. "Arithmetic through household accounting that gives them real skills. I want them to think, not simply perform domestic tasks." "Rousseau would approve," Laurent said, then smiled, though perhaps not his views on women's education specifically. "You're more aligned with Wollstonecraft, I think." For the next hour, they discussed philosophy, educational theory, the revolutionary potential of literacy. Laurent quoted Mill and Kant, debated the merits of various pedagogical approaches, treated her ideas with the seriousness they deserved. This, Evelyn realized, was what intellectual partnership felt like. Not condescension disguised as interest, but genuine exchange between equals. The Kensington Gallery has agreed to host your Unseen series, Laurent said over the main course. A month-long exhibition, opening in 1 week if you consent. London needs to see what you've created. Evelyn set down her fork. My work was never intended for London's judgment. It was created for the women I painted, to honor them. Precisely why London must see it, Laurent insisted. This city honors beauty that conforms, wealth that dazzles. Your paintings honor worth that society overlooks. That's revolutionary, Evelyn. That's necessary. The use of her given name felt natural, unforced. She realized she'd been calling him Laurent rather than Monsieur Beaumont for the past 20 minutes. Over dessert, his expression grew more serious. Lady Evelyn, I haven't been entirely forthcoming about my circumstances. Evelyn's heart sank slightly. Here it came. Whatever complication would ruin this perfect evening. I'm not merely an art dealer, Laurent continued. I am Comte Laurent de Beaumont. My family holds considerable estates in France and significant wealth. I concealed my rank initially because I wanted your assessment of my ideas, not my title. Evelyn stared at him, processing. You're a comte. I am. And I'm revealing myself now because I'm about to make a proposal that requires complete honesty between us. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand. Come to France, not as my guest, but as my partner in creating a network of schools, in establishing galleries for overlooked artists, in building something meaningful together. He paused, his brown eyes steady on hers. And if, over time, we find we suit each other, perhaps as my wife. The proposal hung between them like a held breath. Laurent, I'm honored, Evelyn said carefully. Truly. But I've only just reclaimed my autonomy. The idea of immediately tying myself to another person, however kind. Of course. His smile was understanding, no trace of wounded pride. I don't require an answer now. Agree to the exhibition first. Let London see your work. Then decide about France, about partnership, about everything else. You're very patient. I'm very certain, Laurent corrected gently. I offer you respect, Evelyn. Uncomplicated, genuine respect. No tortured history, no redemption arcs. Simply two people who admire each other building something worthwhile together. Everything Adrian wasn't. Straightforward, easy, safe. But also, Evelyn couldn't help noticing, everything Adrian was. Titled, wealthy, offering to transform her life with his resources and position. The parallel wasn't lost on her. Lady Beatrice was waiting when Evelyn returned to Harrow House, her expression uncharacteristically warm. You're looking flushed, dear. Did you have a pleasant evening? Every instinct Evelyn had developed over years of Beatrice's cruelty screamed, warning. It was pleasant, yes. I'm so glad. Beatrice's smile was saccharine. I've taken the liberty of organizing a small gathering tomorrow afternoon. Just a few close friends. I thought it might be nice to properly reintroduce you to society. I appreciate the thought, but I'm not interested in... Oh, but I've already sent the invitations, Beatrice interrupted smoothly. It would be terribly awkward to cancel now. Besides, the Duke of Blackwell specifically accepted. Evelyn's spine stiffened. You invited the Duke? He's been so generous to your little school. It would be rude not to include him. Beatrice's eyes glittered with malice, poorly disguised as innocence. 3 o'clock tomorrow. Do wear something appropriate. She swept from the room, leaving Evelyn with the certainty that she'd just been maneuvered into a trap. Across London, Adrian spent a sleepless night at his desk. If Evelyn wanted actions rather than words, he would provide them. By dawn, he drafted 3 documents that would irrevocably change his relationship with London society. The first was a letter to the Times. I write to publicly endorse Street Morwen School for Women in Cornwall, under the direction of Lady Evelyn Harrow. Her innovative educational methods demonstrate what can be accomplished when we invest in the intellectual development of all citizens, regardless of gender or class. I call upon my fellow lords to support similar initiatives across England. The second was a series of letters to parliamentary allies, using his political influence to propose legislation supporting female literacy programs. The third was personal, a decision to attend Beatrice's gathering and publicly demonstrate his changed perspective before the very society that had watched him dismiss Evelyn. You're playing with fire, Blackwell, Lord Henry warned when Adrian explained his plans over breakfast. Society doesn't forgive men who contradict their previous positions. Then let them condemn me. Adrian said quietly. I've spent 5 years being what they expected. It's gained me nothing but emptiness. The afternoon gathering at Harrow House assembled like a tribunal. 20 guests crowded the drawing room, all members of the elite circle that had witnessed Evelyn's original humiliation. Lady Thornbury and Cecilia claimed the best seats. Lord Henry and his wife positioned themselves near the windows. Various other lords and ladies arranged themselves with the careful attention to hierarchy that London society had perfected over centuries. And, conspicuously, near the fireplace, stood the Duke of Blackwell. When Evelyn descended the stairs in afternoon dress of deep amber, simple but striking against her colouring, every eye turned. The whispers began immediately. She does carry herself better than she used to. Still plain, though, wouldn't you say? I heard the Comte de Beaumont is courting her. Can you imagine? Beatrice played the doting stepmother with theatrical perfection. My dear stepdaughter, who's accomplished so much in Cornwall, we're all simply fascinated by your quaint educational project. How charitable of you, Evelyn, Lady Thornbury contributed, to spend your time with fishermen's daughters. Such noble self-sacrifice. Evelyn recognized the setup, but couldn't see where it was leading. Yet, and we've all been fascinated, Beatrice continued with calculated innocence, by the Duke of Blackwell's sudden interest in women's education. Such a surprising passion for a man who once said, "Now, what was it exactly?" Before she could finish, Evelyn spoke clearly. The Duke said that he danced with ladies who enhanced his reputation, not diminished it. He said this about me 5 years ago, in a room much like this one. Shocked silence fell like a curtain. Many of you were present, Evelyn continued, her voice steady. Some of you laughed. All of you remembered it enough to gossip about it for months afterward. So let's not pretend we're discussing ancient, forgotten history. Adrian stood, drawing every eye. Lady Evelyn is correct. I said those words, and I was wrong, catastrophically, shamefully wrong. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. I stood in a ballroom 5 years ago, Adrian continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse, and dismissed a kind, intelligent woman because I was too shallow to see past society's arbitrary standards of beauty. Too proud to risk my reputation by acknowledging worth that didn't announce itself with fashionable gowns and aristocratic connections. Lady Thornbury made a small sound of disapproval, but Adrian pressed on. I watched her be humiliated and banished, and I did nothing. I told myself it was appropriate, that she was unsuited for our society. The truth is that I was unsuited for anyone's society, too cowardly to defend the vulnerable, too concerned with my own standing to risk it for decency. He turned to face Evelyn directly. Lady Evelyn has built schools, educated hundreds of women, created art that honors human dignity. I've maintained estates and attended parties. She spent 5 years becoming someone worthy of admiration. I've spent 5 years regretting that I failed to be someone worthy of her regard. His gaze swept across the assembled society. So judge me, if you will. Gossip about the Duke, who publicly admitted fault. But know this, if you mock Lady Evelyn now, you mock someone who has accomplished more genuine good than everyone in this room combined. The silence stretched. Then Lord Henry began to clap, slowly at first, then with genuine enthusiasm. Blackwell speaks truth. I was there that night. We were all cruel. Lady Evelyn deserved better than our contempt. How dramatic, Lady Thornbury sniffed. Surely we're all overthinking a minor social incident from years ago. It wasn't minor to Lady Evelyn, Mother, Cecilia said quietly, surprising everyone in the room, perhaps herself most of all. We were horrid to her. I was horrid to her. Beatrice, seeing her carefully orchestrated humiliation transforming into Adrian's redemption, unleashed her venom. How touching, Your Grace. Though one wonders if your sudden conscience is motivated by genuine remorse or by the fact that my stepdaughter has attracted the attention of a French comte. Perhaps you're less interested in making amends and more interested in preventing competition. To Evelyn's own surprise, she found herself defending Adrian. His Grace's motives are his own, Lady Beatrice, but his actions funding educational initiatives, advocating publicly for women's opportunities, speak more clearly than speculation. From the corner of the room, a tremulous voice interrupted. Lady Beatrice, perhaps we should discuss why you were so eager to banish Lady Evelyn 5 years ago. All eyes turned to Miss Henrietta Walsh, Lady Thornbury's pale companion, who looked terrified but determined. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Beatrice said sharply. I was employed in the Harrow household 5 years ago, Henrietta continued, her voice growing stronger. I overheard conversations between you and Lord Ashford, the affair you were conducting. You feared Lady Evelyn might innocently reveal something, so you orchestrated her exile. That's a lie. Beatrice's composure cracked. I heard the rumors too, another guest, Mrs. Peters admitted reluctantly. We all suppressed them out of courtesy, but Lord Ashford was quite indiscreet before his death. The room turned on Beatrice like a pack scenting blood. A widow having an affair was scandalous. Orchestrating a stepdaughter's banishment to conceal it was unforgivable. One by one, guests made excuses and departed, distancing themselves from Beatrice's toxic reputation with the ruthless efficiency London society had perfected. Within 20 minutes, only Adrian and Evelyn remained. Beatrice had fled to her chambers, her social standing in ruins. I didn't want this, Evelyn said quietly, sinking into a chair. I didn't come to London seeking revenge. Perhaps justice finds its own way, Adrian offered. Evelyn looked at him with tired eyes. Was Beatrice right? Are you motivated by competition with Laurent? Adrian moved to sit across from her, maintaining respectful distance. Jealousy? Yes. I won't pretend I'm not jealous of a man who had the sense to value you from the beginning, but that's not why I spoke today. I spoke because I've been a coward for 5 years, and I'm trying, perhaps failing, but trying to be better. A knock interrupted. A messenger handed Evelyn a note. She read it, her expression unreadable. The Kensington Gallery exhibition opens in 3 days. Laurent has arranged everything. Will you do it? Adrian asked. I don't know. It means exposing my most vulnerable work to the society that rejected me. Let me attend, Adrian said suddenly. Not as a suitor, not to compete with Beaumont, but as someone who wants to support your work. You're under no obligation to acknowledge me, speak to me, or even notice my presence. But let me be there. Evelyn studied him for a long moment. The exhibition isn't about you, Adrian. It's about the women I painted, the work I've built. If you attend, remember that. I will. That evening, Evelyn stood at her window watching London's lights flicker in the gathering dusk. 2 men wanted her. Society had turned its vicious attention to Beatrice instead of her. And in 3 days, her art, her soul, really, would be displayed for judgment. The exhibition would expose more than paintings. It would reveal truths about beauty, worth, and the woman who'd been called plain. London wasn't prepared, but then again, London never was. Chapter 8. The Woman They Couldn't Forget. 3 days later, the Kensington Gallery had been transformed into something extraordinary. The walls were draped in deep blue fabric that made Evelyn's paintings luminous against the backdrop, each portrait lit to perfection. 20 works comprised the Unseen series fishwives with weathered faces and kind eyes, teachers with ink-stained fingers and patient smiles, widows who had built businesses from grief, students whose hunger for knowledge radiated from the canvas. Each woman painted with profound dignity, capturing strength that society habitually overlooked. But in the gallery's place of honor, commanding attention the moment one entered, hung The Girl They Called Plain. Evelyn's self-portrait from 5 years ago arrested the eye with its raw vulnerability. The girl in faded lilac muslin stood half-hidden by potted palms at a ball, her grey-blue eyes holding quiet sadness, but also unmistakable dignity. Evelyn had painted her younger self with such tenderness, such compassion, that she became heartbreakingly beautiful, not despite her pain, but encompassing it. It's perfect, Laurent said, standing beside Evelyn as guests began to arrive. Everything is perfect. Evelyn wore deep blue silk that matched the walls, simple and elegant, her hair arranged loosely, but her hands trembled slightly as London's elite filtered through the gallery doors. What if they hate it? She whispered. Then they're fools, Laurent replied firmly, and their opinion will not matter. But it would matter, Evelyn knew, not because she needed their validation, but because their reaction would reveal whether anything had truly changed in 5 years, in them, in her, in the world they both inhabited. The turnout was surprising. The scandal surrounding Beatrice had paradoxically increased interest in Evelyn. Everyone wanted to see the woman at the center of society's latest drama. Lord Henry arrived with his wife, both greeting Evelyn with genuine warmth. Cecilia Thornbury appeared without her mother, her expression uncertain but curious. Various lords and ladies circulated with champagne and assessment. Art critics from major newspapers moved through the exhibition with notebooks, their faces thoughtful. Educational reformers clustered near the portraits of Evelyn's students, discussing possibilities in urgent whispers, and notably, near the back of the gallery, the Duke of Blackwell stood alone. Adrian had dressed impeccably but without ostentation, his dark coat and grey waistcoat speaking of restraint rather than display. He positioned himself where he could observe without imposing, keeping his promise not to intrude on Evelyn's night. But his eyes found her immediately, and didn't leave. Laurent moved to the centre of the gallery and raised his hand for attention. Conversations quieted as London society turned toward the elegant Frenchman. "Art reveals what society obscures," he began, his accented English lending weight to his words. "Lady Evelyn Harrow has created portraits that force us to see worth we habitually overlook." He gestured toward the paintings surrounding them. "These works are not merely technically accomplished, though they are morally necessary. They insist that beauty and value exist beyond ballrooms and fashion, beyond wealth and pedigree." His gaze found Evelyn, and his smile was warm. "I present to you not just an artist, but a visionary Lady Evelyn Grace Harrow." Applause rippled through the gallery as Evelyn moved forward, her heart pounding. "I'm not accustomed to public speaking," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "and I'm certainly not accustomed to having London's attention directed toward me with anything other than dismissal." A few uncomfortable shifts in the crowd. "Good, let them feel uncomfortable. These portraits are of women I've had the privilege to know in Cornwall," she continued. "Women who taught me that worth isn't assigned by others, it's inherent. It exists whether or not anyone acknowledges it." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "5 years ago, I was told I was plain, forgettable, unsuited for notice. Those words nearly destroyed me." Her eyes swept across the assembly, touching briefly on faces that had mocked her. "But they also freed me to discover what I valued in myself, independent of society's judgment." Adrian's hands clenched at his sides, though Evelyn couldn't see him from where she stood. "I hope these paintings make you uncomfortable," Evelyn said quietly. "I hope they force you to question who you see and who you overlook. I hope they remind you that dismissing someone says more about your limited vision than their limited worth." The silence that followed was profound. Then someone began to clap, not Lord Henry this time, but Cecilia Thornbury. Others joined gradually, the applause building until it filled the gallery. As guests dispersed to examine the paintings more closely, critics made notes with furrowed brows. One muttered to his colleague, "Revolutionary in subject and execution. This will cause quite a stir." Cecilia approached Evelyn during a quiet moment, her expression vulnerable in a way Evelyn had never seen. "I was cruel to you," she said without preamble. "Not just 5 years ago, but every time we encountered each other. I'm sorry. Your work it's extraordinary." Evelyn studied the young woman who had once laughed at her dismissal. "Thank you, Cecilia. That means more than you might realize." "I think I was jealous," Cecilia admitted. "You had something I didn't purpose, conviction. I've spent my whole life being ornamental. You've spent yours being meaningful. It's not too late to change that," Evelyn said gently. Cecilia's eyes brightened. "Do you truly think so?" "I know so." Across the gallery, Adrian stood before the girl they called plain, utterly transfixed. He saw her now, really saw her. The girl in lilac standing isolated at a ball, her expression holding quiet dignity, despite obvious pain. The way Evelyn had painted herself revealed everything. She had known her worth even then. She had seen herself clearly worthy, beautiful in her vulnerability, deserving of notice and care. He was the one who had been blind. "That's her, isn't it?" someone whispered nearby. "From that night at the Ashford ball, the Duke's been staring at it for 20 minutes, another voice murmured. "Quite telling, wouldn't you say?" Adrian didn't care. Let them whisper. Let them judge. This painting was evidence of how completely he had failed someone who deserved infinitely better. "You painted yourself with such tenderness," a quiet voice said beside him. Adrian startled. Evelyn had approached silently, now standing at his shoulder, both of them gazing at her younger self. "Even after everything," he continued, his voice rough, "you saw worth in her." "I had to," Evelyn replied softly. "No one else did." "I did." The words escaped before Adrian could stop them. "I see it now. I saw it then, if I'm honest, but I was too afraid to acknowledge it." Evelyn turned to look at him fully. "Why afraid?" Adrian's throat worked. "Because if I admitted I saw worth in someone society dismissed, I'd have to question every other assumption I built my life upon. It was easier to be cruel than to be honest. Before Evelyn could respond, Laurent appeared with champagne and protective concern. "You're being monopolized, my dear," he said, his hand coming to rest at the small of Evelyn's back, proprietary but respectful. Several patrons wished to discuss commissioning work. The contrast between the two men was stark. Laurent, open and solicitous. Adrian, tortured and uncertain. "Of course," Evelyn said. "Adrian, if you'll excuse me." She allowed Laurent to guide her away, leaving Adrian alone with the portrait of the girl he'd destroyed. Midway through the evening, Laurent drew Evelyn into a quieter corner of the gallery. "The exhibition is a triumph," he said, his brown eyes warm. "London sees your talent, Evelyn, but this city will always be complicated for you. Too much history, too much pain." He took her hand gently. "Come to France with me. We'll establish schools together, create galleries for overlooked artists. You can paint, teach, build something entirely yours, without the weight of painful memories." His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "And if, in time, you find you can trust me, care for me, perhaps even love me, I would be honored. But even if not, I offer you partnership and respect." "Laurent." "I sail in 4 days," he said. "I can delay passage if you need more time, but I hope you'll say yes." Across the gallery, Adrian saw the intimate conversation, saw Laurent's earnest expression, saw Evelyn's considering posture. Panic seized him. If she left for France, he would lose any chance of proving he'd changed, of building something real with the only woman who had ever mattered. In a breach of all social protocol, Adrian moved to the center of the gallery and raised his voice. "If I might have everyone's attention, please." Conversations halted. Every eye turned to the Duke, who looked uncharacteristically disheveled, emotional rather than composed, vulnerable rather than controlled. "I want to publicly acknowledge something that should have been said 5 years ago," Adrian began, his voice carrying through the sudden silence. "Lady Evelyn Harrow is one of the most remarkable people I've ever encountered." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "I dismissed her once because I was shallow, proud, and blind to anything that didn't conform to my narrow expectations. I've spent 5 years trying to make amends from a distance because I was too cowardly to face her directly." His eyes found Evelyn's across the room. "I funded her school not out of guilt, though I have abundant guilt, but out of genuine belief in her vision. I wrote letters I never sent because I had no right to burden her with my regret. I've watched from afar as she accomplished more genuine good than I've managed in my entire privileged life." Society stood frozen, scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. "Evelyn," Adrian said, his voice breaking slightly, "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to choose me over a man who's been nothing but respectful and worthy. I'm simply asking you to know that you changed me, not by returning to London, but by existing in the world as someone I failed so completely." Silence stretched like glass about to shatter. Then Lord Henry began to applaud, slowly at first, then with genuine enthusiasm. Others joined, not everyone, but enough. Laurent watched Evelyn's face carefully, seeing emotions flicker surprise, pain, something softer he couldn't quite identify. And Evelyn, standing in the center of London, society's attention, walked through the silent gallery until she stood directly before Adrian. "Adrian Blackwell," she said clearly, "you've made a spectacle of yourself." A pause. Then her mouth curved in a slight smile. "But perhaps you needed to. Perhaps we both needed this, for you to be vulnerable and for me to witness it." She took a breath. "You hurt me terribly 5 years ago. That pain was real and profound, and it changed the course of my life." Adrian's face crumpled, but Evelyn continued. "And yet, I can't entirely regret it. If you'd been kind that night, I might have married you, a girl desperate for approval, waiting on your attention. I would have been miserable, and you would have remained exactly as you were." Understanding dawned in Adrian's eyes. "These 5 years forced both of us to become people we weren't," Evelyn said. "You learned to question your assumptions. I learned to value my worth independent of anyone's validation." She turned to Laurent, her expression tender. "Laurent, you've offered me respect, opportunity, genuine partnership. These are precious gifts, and I'm honored by them. But," Laurent said gently, already knowing, "if I went to France with you now, I'd be running again. Not from cruelty this time, but from complexity, from unfinished business." Laurent nodded with understanding grace. "Then you must stay and finish it. He raised her hand to his lips. "When you're ready for France, if you're ever ready, write to me. The offer stands indefinitely." He departed with dignity, leaving Evelyn and Adrian facing each other while London society watched with bated breath. "Adrian," Evelyn said quietly, "I don't know if I can love you. Too much has happened. Too much hurt exists between us." "I know," he whispered, "but I'm willing to discover if we can build something new. Not a resurrection of what might have been 5 years ago, but something entirely different." Hope flickered in Adrian's eyes. "We start as acquaintances becoming friends," Evelyn continued. "You prove through sustained action, not grand gestures, but daily choices, that you've genuinely changed. And I remain autonomous. My school, my work, my life remain mine." "I want nothing less," Adrian said fervently. "I don't want to rescue you or complete you. I want to know you as you actually are, and, if I'm extraordinarily fortunate, earn your partnership." Evelyn extended her hand. "Then let us begin again, Adrian Blackwell." He took it carefully, as if she might shatter. Around them, applause erupted, genuine this time, celebrating not scandal but possibility. 3 months later, on a December afternoon in Cornwall, snow fell softly over Thornfield Cottage's garden. Evelyn stood among the winter roses' hardy blooms that refused to surrender to cold, and watched Adrian approach along the cliff path. He came to Cornwall every fortnight now, not to court her in traditional ways, but to participate in the school's work. He taught mathematics to advanced students, helped repair the building, treated fishermen's daughters with the same respect he showed duchesses. He had become, slowly and through sustained action, someone worth knowing. "You're early," Evelyn said as he reached her. "I couldn't stay away." Adrian's smile was tentative. "I wanted to see you." They walked along the cliffs, discussing the book she'd lent him, arguing about politics, slowly learning each other's minds and hearts. Finally, as snow dusted their shoulders, Evelyn stopped and turned to face him. "I think I might be falling in love with you," she said. "Not the Duke of Blackwell, but Adrian, the man who spent 3 months proving his character through action." Adrian's breath caught. "I've been in love with you since I saw you in Hatchard's bookshop and realized the woman I dismissed was extraordinary. But I'm more in love with you now, knowing you fully." He pulled papers from his coat. "I have something for you. Not a ring, not yet. But this." Evelyn examined the legal documents, establishing a joint trust for educational initiatives across England, funded equally by both of them. "Marry me, Evelyn," Adrian said quietly. "Not because I'm a duke or because you were once dismissed and now I'm making amends. Marry me because we can build something meaningful together, because your mind challenges mine, because I want to spend my life proving worthy of your partnership." Evelyn looked up from the papers, snow catching in her hair. "Yes, on the condition that we're equals in all things property, decisions, life. I would expect nothing less." Their kiss was tender, respectful, full of promise. Snow fell around them, and the winter roses bloomed against all odds. The wedding, held in Penrith Small Church 3 months later, was attended by fishing families and students, Lord Henry and his wife, Mrs. Wren and Mrs. Alcott, and a handful of friends. Not a society spectacle, but a genuine celebration. London gossip churned for months over the scandal of a duke marrying a woman he'd once dismissed. But Adrian and Evelyn didn't care. They were in Cornwall, building schools and lives, creating something that mattered. In her studio at Thornfield, Evelyn completed a companion piece to The Girl They Called Plain, a portrait of herself now, titled The Woman Who Knew Her Worth. Same grey-blue eyes, same light brown hair, but radiating confidence and peace. Years later, when people asked Evelyn about her extraordinary life, she would smile and say, "They said I was plain, forgettable, unsuited for notice. They were wrong. But their wrongness freed me to discover what I was always meant to be. Not a woman defined by society's gaze, but a woman who chose herself, again and again, until someone finally saw what had always been there." And Adrian, overhearing, would add quietly, "I thought I knew what beauty was, decorative, fashionable, socially advantageous. I was catastrophically wrong. Real beauty is courage, purpose, resilience, and I nearly missed it entirely." On a cliff-top in Cornwall, as the sun set over the endless sea, 2 figures stood side by side, neither leading nor following, but walking together as equals. Behind them, Street Morwen's school glowed with lamplight, dozens of students learning, growing, becoming. Before them, the sea stretched toward limitless possibility, and Evelyn Grace Harrow, the woman they'd called plain, the woman they couldn't forget, knew she had finally found exactly where she belonged. If Evelyn's journey from dismissal to triumph moved you, like this video and subscribe for more stories of resilience and redemption. Comment: what would you say to someone who once underestimated you? Next story drops tomorrow. The governess he scorned returns as the heiress he desperately needs. Don't miss it. Remember, you were never the problem. Their vision was. See you in the next story.